Chapter 32 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 32. In Odessa, General View of Russia. Get out your passports and have your keys ready. We are at anchor in the harbor of Odessa, and the Russian officials are coming aboard. There they are now, just inside the gangway. Those big, black-bearded men in long coats and black caps with the soldiers beside them. We shall have to show them papers from our government describing just who we are before they will permit us to land. This custom is universal in Russia. All who enter the empire must have passports, and it is impossible to travel through the interior without them. We shall be asked for our passports at every hotel, and our names will be registered at the police stations wherever we stop. We may need them when we buy tickets on the railway and also at the post and telegraph offices. Even the natives must have passports when they leave home, for records are kept of the strangers in every town, so that it is said the Tsar knows just where every man in his empire sleeps every night. We need our keys to open our baggage, that the officers may see that there are no books or papers in it containing articles against the government, and also that we are not smuggling goods into the country. The Russian Empire is so vast, and it has so many different kinds of people, that it is difficult for one man to rule it. It has some citizens who would like to overthrow the government, and for this reason the officials are always on guard. Our passports, however, show that we are good American citizens. We are treated politely. The officials merely look into our trunks, and within a short time we have received permission to enter the city and are riding in our droskies over the paved streets of Odessa to the hotel. How strange everything is! We seem to be in a new world. The people are different, and even the horses look queer, as they trot along with great yokes above them, drawing all sorts of odd vehicles. Notice the droski in which we are riding. It is about half as big as one of our carriages. Its wheels are no larger than those of a bicycle, and its floor is about a foot from the ground. A big black horse is harnessed to the shafts, which end at the front in a yoke, rising a foot and a half above his neck. There are no tugs. The shafts are fastened to the collar just under the yoke. What an odd-looking driver! He weighs about 300 pounds, and his long navy blue gown, tied with a red sash at the waist, makes him look bigger. His hat is bell-shaped, and his long black beard hangs far down on his breast. He is proud of his size, for to have a fat coachman is the sign of prosperity, and it is said that many of the gowns of the droski drivers are padded and quilted, and that some even have little pillows inside them to make their owners look fat. Our man holds his arms straight out in front of him as he drives. He slaps the horse with the reins to make him go faster, and stops him by saying "Brrr" instead of "Whoa." Now look at the people on the streets. What a variety of curious costumes! Odessa is the chief city of southern Russia, and men from all the countries about come here to trade. There are Turks and Armenians in fez caps and dark clothes. There are Greek sailors wearing gay jackets, white petticoats, and red shoes turned up at the toes. There are fierce-looking Circassians in high caps of astrakhan fur, and merchants from Persia in turbans and gowns. There are Russians everywhere. We know them by their big frames and fine faces. The men are tall and broad-shouldered, and most of them have long, thick beards. The women are tall, handsome, and stately. Many are very well dressed, although the peasant women wear rough shoes, bright cotton gowns, and have handkerchiefs bound around their heads. What a lot of caps, long coats, and top boots! Every man and boy is thus clad. The soldiers wear caps, the officers wear caps, and so do the common people. Even little boys have visored caps and overcoats, just like their fathers, and some very little girls wear caps of bright silk. How queer the stores are! The signs are in the strange Russian letters, so different from ours that we cannot tell what they mean. There is a newsboy crying his papers. The printing upon them looks as strange as the Chinese characters on tea boxes, and we cannot understand the jargon he utters. We can't even talk with our driver, and are glad when we reach the hotel where the porter speaks English. He acts as our interpreter, giving us rooms and arranging our meals. Next day we take a guide and explore Odessa. It is the chief grain port of South Russia and has a vast trade. We visit the wharves and the chief business sections, and then take the train for our long ride through Russia in Europe. Russia is by far the largest country in Europe and one of the largest of the whole world. The Russians have more land than any other nation except the British. They own more than half of all Europe and considerably more than one-third of all Asia. Their possessions in Asia are almost as big as the whole of South America, and in Europe they have two-thirds as much land as the United States without Alaska, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Altogether, they have more than one-seventh of all the land surface of the globe. Our travels at present are to be confined to Russia in Europe, and even this is so vast, as we see by the space it has on the map, that we might travel a year and not visit every part of it. Still, a rapid run through it, stopping in the great cities and spending some time in the villages and on the farms, will give us a good idea of the country and people. Let us first take a bird's-eye view of European Russia. It consists of a vast plain hemmed in by the Ural Mountains on the east and by the Baltic Sea, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Rumania on the west, extending from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, and nowhere having any hills over 1,100 feet high. The chief hills, except those at the extreme south, lie just north of the center of Russia, where the land rises, making a watershed from which the rivers flow north and south, furnishing water to the most of the plain and giving a cheap means of carrying goods from one part of it to another. Many of the rivers are connected by canals, and as we shall see later, the country has an excellent system of commercial waterways. If a bird should start at the Arctic Ocean and fly clear across Russia to get the view we are taking, it would start upon a coast which is bordered with vast morasses or cold swamps called tundras. Everything there is bleak and dreary. The trees are stunted, and the only human beings to be seen are the strange Lapps and Samoyeds, semi-savages with light yellow faces, high cheekbones, and eyes somewhat slanting. They live in bark tents and look not unlike the Laplanders we saw in Norway, and they have much the same habits, roaming about with their reindeer, grazing them on the mosses and the lichens which grow on the tundras. Passing this region, the bird would fly southward for hundreds upon hundreds of miles over vast forests. It would go for days over nothing but trees, trees, trees. Now and then it might see a bear, a deer, or a wolf, but seldom anything human. In this forest zone of Russia there are thousands of square miles which are entirely uninhabited, where there are no railroads, and where all nature is as wild as it was in our country in the days when the Indians owned it. At the north the trees are chiefly stunted pines, but farther south there are magnificent beeches, firs, and other valuable timber. The forests cover two-fifths of the country, extending, with some clearings here and there, even as far south as Moscow. Coming out of the trees, our bird would next pass over a well-populated region, which produces vast quantities of barley, flax, and hemp, and then enter the third zone, the famous Black Earth zone of Russia. This is a vast plain which stretches from the Carpathian Mountains clear across to the Urals, and which is covered with some of the richest soil on the face of the globe. The land is a thick sheet of black earth, a sort of half mold, from 3 to 20 feet deep, so rich that it has yielded good crops of wheat for many generations without fertilization. This is the best part of Russia and the chief source of its wealth, producing large quantities of grain for export. The country here is well populated. It has cities and towns and countless farm villages. Beyond this there are lands producing Indian corn, and farther south, bordering on the edge of the Caucasus Mountains and the Black and the Caspian Seas, are other plains or steppes which are not so rich, but upon which wild grasses grow in great luxuriance, where vast herds of horses, cattle, and sheep are to be seen. Such is a rough idea of European Russia: great flat plains of cold swamps, of mighty forests, of rich farms and pastures, of a few large cities and a vast number of villages. We shall visit the chief cities later on. Odessa is about as large as Detroit. So, too, is Kiev, just north of it, on the Dnieper, surrounded by a rich farming country. Warsaw in Poland is bigger than St. Louis, and Lodz than Cincinnati, while Riga is of about the size of Minneapolis. St. Petersburg has more people than Philadelphia, and Moscow is almost as large. In addition to these important places, there are other cities ranging in size from 300,000 to 50,000, and there are many still smaller. But we shall see all this better as we go on with our travels. Russia has the longest railroads in the world, and there are steamers on all the chief rivers, so that we can visit the principal parts of the country. Our train from Odessa takes us rapidly northward. The road is smooth and well built. The track is as well kept as our gardens. We often see women on their knees pulling the grass from between the ties, and every few miles there are men working on the railroad. At each road crossing a barefooted, bareheaded peasant girl in a dress of bright colors stands waving a flag to warn the people back while the train passes, and at every station a tall guard in uniform, with a pistol on his hip and a long sword at his side, walks up and down the platform. He is the representative of the Czar, and he wears the Czar's uniform, a red cap with a tall feather in it, a long overcoat, and high boots with spurs. There are many things about the trains that are different from ours. Look out as we go around this curve and see the dense black smoke pouring out of the engine. That comes from the petroleum which is used as fuel, because the oil fields about the Caspian Sea make it cheaper than coal in this treeless region. Farther north, in the forest zone, the smoke will become a light blue, for our locomotive will make steam with wood. We shall have great racks filled with wood just back of the engine. It will keep 2 firemen busy throwing it into the furnaces, while at every few stations we shall see acres of wood piles. Our cars are by no means uncomfortable. We are riding first class on an express train. We have seats near the windows, and our fellow passengers are officials and well-to-do Russians, many of whom speak English and tell us much of their country and people. Every now and then we pass a slower train, largely composed of second and third-class cars. The second-class cars are more cheaply furnished than those of the first class. They are patronized by the merchants and the richer of the common people. The third-class cars are not much better than cattle cars. The seats are rude benches, and they are crowded with peasants. Notice that train which is waiting there on the side track. It is filled with long-bearded, shock-haired men in rough cotton clothes, and with women in short cotton gowns of bright colors, with shawls and handkerchiefs tied around their heads. The men wear caps, and they have boots of felt or leather. The shoes of many of the women are of straw, and in place of stockings they have rags tied around their legs. Each man has a great bundle beside him or under his feet. That is his baggage. In the third class, the most of the baggage is taken into the cars. At some of the depots, we see the people using their bundles as pillows, sleeping on the stones while they wait for the train. Take a look at the station where our train is stopping. It has a stone platform, and the building is large and well kept. That bell against the wall is for starting the train. The station has an excellent restaurant. The Russians are fond of good living. They are always eating, and tea, cake, and fruit are brought to our window at every station. The tea is served in glass tumblers, with 2 or 3 lumps of sugar and a slice of lemon, but without milk. We try to drink it in the approved Russian fashion. We squeeze the lemon into the tea, and then putting the hard sugar lump between our teeth, slowly suck the tea through it. It tastes good, but we soon go back to our old way of drinking, for the custom ruins the teeth, and we notice that many Russians on this account have teeth which are badly decayed. The Russians drink more tea perhaps than any other people, and every family has its samovar filled with hot water. The samovar is a brass urn with a pipe running through its center, in which burning charcoal keeps the water hot, so that by turning a spigot fresh tea can be made at any time of the day. There are samovars at all the stations, and the tea peddlers behind them are long-haired, long-bearded men, with faces as rosy, fat, and jolly as that of old Santa Claus. We are a long time crossing the steppes of southern Russia. We pass vast herds of cattle and horses watched by Russian cowboys, and see large flocks of sheep, some of which are tended by women and children. Now we go through a region of vineyards, and again through fields of Indian corn, barley, and rye. As we travel northward, the country grows better and the land more densely populated, until at last we reach the black earth zone. We are now in the granary of Russia, which produces a large part of the food of the empire, and which in good seasons grows so much wheat that it forms our chief competitor in the food markets of Europe. End of chapter 22. Chapter 33 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 33. The Russian Peasants, a Nation of Villages. We are now in the Great Black Plain, in one of the regions where we can best study the people of Russia. This vast empire may be compared to a huge farm, for the Russians are largely a nation of farmers. The Russian people are made up of the emperor and his officials, of comparatively few nobles, of a few million merchants and artisans who dwell in the cities, and a vast number of peasants living in villages surrounded by farms. The most important part of Russia is village Russia. The country contains about 100 million peasants who live in 500,000 villages. Let us stop a moment and try to realize what this means. There are so many of these peasants that if all the men, women, and children of all the world could be gathered into one place, 1 in every 15 would be a Russian peasant farmer. In our ride to the Black Earth Zone from Odessa, we have not seen a single house by itself in the fields. There were no fences marking off the farms as in America, and no barns nor haystacks standing alone. Excepting the cowboys and the shepherdesses watching the flocks, we did not see a person alone in the fields. The people were working in gangs of from half a dozen to 100, going out together in the morning and coming back in the same way at night. At every few miles we passed little groups of thatched huts, and we could see other huts in groups dotting the country on both sides the track. Each collection of huts was a Russian village, a type of the thousands of villages in all parts of European Russia, and even in the newest settlements of Siberia as well. But let us get off at this station and visit one of the villages. That man over there in the long overcoat, cap, high boots, and sword is the government guard. He puts his hand to his cap and makes a military salute as we accost him. He gives our guide the proper directions, and within a short time we are driving at full speed over the fields. Our vehicle is a sort of boat-like tub on wheels, to which 3 horses are fastened. 1 horse is inside the shafts, and the others, 1 on each side, are hitched to bars which extend from the ends of the axle of the front wheels. The carriage and team look sorry enough, and we get in with much fear and trembling. We have hardly taken our seats, however, before the driver cracks his whip and the horses go off at great speed. The one in the shafts trots at a 4-minute pace, and those outside go on the gallop, so that we fairly fly through the air. The road is right over the fields, and we drive through green and yellow oceans of rye and wheat, which are moving up and down in billows under the winds. We cross long fields of yellow sunflowers and go on through meadows where hundreds of sheep are feeding, watched by shepherds who lean on their staffs and gaze at us in wonder. At last we come to our village. It has but one long street lined with straggling thatched huts. There are no sidewalks, and the street is a wide grass plot, except in the middle, where the carts have cut deep ruts in the earth. There are trees here and there on each side of the roadway. Under one of them a woman is knitting, with her children about her. She has tied a box in which lies her baby to one of the branches above her, and she swings it now and then as she works. Farther down on the other side of the street are some frowsy-headed, barefooted boys and girls playing. As we stop they stand and stare at us, while the dogs run out and bark, showing their teeth. Take a look at the huts. Few of them have gardens about them. There are no fences to shut them off from their neighbors or from the road. The average home is a one-story log cabin about 20 feet square, roofed with straw thatch about 1.5 feet thick. Where wood is scarce, the huts are often made of woven twigs plastered with mud. A few of the larger houses have barns or stables joined to them in an L at the rear, so that the animals and people live under the same roof. Let us enter one of the little homes. They are all made the same way, each having 2 rooms and a loft. We first go into an anteroom which is used as a storeroom and stable. There is harness hanging upon the walls, farming tools lie upon the floor, and bags of corn are piled up in a corner. A chicken runs between our legs as we enter, and a calf at the back looks as though it might do the same. Passing through this room, we reach the other room of the house. Indeed, it might be called the only room, for the first is little more than a vestibule, while this room serves as kitchen, dining room, bedroom, and parlor. At one side of it there is a brick stove, or oven and chimney combined, so built up from the floor that there is a ledge 4 feet wide and about 6 feet long just over the oven and under the ceiling. In the oven the cooking is done, and that ledge above it is the common bed of the family. There in the winter as many can crawl in and sleep on the hot bricks while the others lie on the floor. There are no bedsteads and little or no bedclothing. The whole family huddle together like so many sheep, men and women, boys and girls, babies and grandparents, all bunched in together. They sleep in the same clothes they wear in the daytime, and rely largely upon their own animal heat and the oven to keep themselves warm. As we enter, our host asks us to be seated, and we look around for chairs. There are only 2 to be seen, but we take seats on the benches which run around the wall. There is a bare table at one side of the room, and the man asks us to stay and have dinner with him. We do so, and watch his wife lay the table. She does this very quickly, for they use no tablecloth, and no plates, knives, or forks. All she does is put a wooden basin, about as big as a common tin wash basin, filled with cabbage soup, in the center of the board, and lay some wooden spoons beside it. We are hungry after our jolting ride over the fields, and the soup gives forth an appetizing odor as it smokes away on the table. The woman now motions us to draw up our benches. We sit down with the family. We are each given a wooden spoon, about as big as the largest tablespoon, and are told to dip in. We are at a loss how to begin until our host puts in his spoon and conveys some soup to his mouth. We do likewise, each dipping in turn until the basin is empty. In addition to the soup, we each have black bread and raw cucumbers. There is no butter, and the meal seems plain and scanty, after our luxurious living at the Russian hotels. Still, such is the common everyday food of millions of Russians. Some of the peasants have cows and chickens, and hence milk and eggs. Now and then they may have a little fish or meat, but as a rule, if they have cabbage soup and bread, they think they do very well. We are surprised to find how many people live in one hut. Sometimes as many as 12 live in one room. The most of the Russian peasants are poor, and very few save money. They do not seem to care for the future, and live from hand to mouth, so that if a bad season occurs, a famine ensues, and they die by the thousand. If you tell them they should save for bad times may come, they will say, "Oh, God and the Tsar will provide." The Russian peasants have but few wants. If a man has a suit of sheepskin for the winter, and of cotton for the summer, with perhaps an extra suit for Sundays and holidays, he is quite content. In the hot weather he wears a red calico shirt outside his white or blue cotton trousers. The trousers are fastened by a string around the waist, and are often bound in just below the knees with rags, which wrapped around and round the legs and feet serve also for stockings. The richer peasants wear leather boots and long overcoats of cloth or skin. The poor have felt boots for winter and slippers of woven grass or bark for summer. The woman's dress consists chiefly of a bright-colored handkerchief which is tied round the head so that one corner falls down over the neck at the back, a loose gown of white, red, or blue cotton cut low at the neck, which reaches almost to her ankles, and an apron gathered in at the waist and extending down to her knees. A pair of rag stockings and straw or bark shoes completes the costume. The dress of both women and men varies considerably in different parts of the empire. One of the oddest things in our village is the bathhouse. The peasants do not wash often, but when they do they boil or steam themselves clean. They get into an oven-like bathhouse which is filled with steam, and remain there until they have perspired the dirt out of their pores. They look parboiled when they come out, but the steam makes them really much cleaner than a bath in warm water would. In the cities there are large public baths containing many steam rooms. The peasants are very religious. We shall find churches in every district, and in every hut we enter a candle is burning away under an icon, or a painting of the Saviour, the Virgin Mary, or one of the saints. The peasant always says a prayer when he starts out to work. He says a prayer and crosses himself whenever he passes a church, and he crosses himself when he stops work to go home. He would not think of living in a house without one of the holy pictures on his walls, and he often makes pilgrimages to shrines and churches which are considered especially sacred. The most of the peasants are uneducated. Very few of them can read and write, although of late schools for peasant children have been established in the different parts of the empire. The peasants are much like children. They call the Tsar father and look up to him with reverence. They were for a long time in a state of serfdom to the nobles. They were almost the same as slaves, and it was only at about the time of our civil war that the Tsar made them free. They are gradually growing more and more independent, and at some time will probably form a very strong and great nation. The peasants own about 1/3 of the cultivated lands of Russia, but they hold this land in a curious way. In the United States every farmer has his own farm, and he plants his crops and pays his taxes without asking questions of anyone. In Russia, each village owns a large block of land in common, and the taxes are paid by the village and not by the individual. Each village is known as a mir. This word means world, for each village is a little world in itself. The mir is supposed to own the houses and lands of the village, and to divide them up among the people from year to year, each person having an equal right to the whole. Every family keeps its house and a little strip of ground, but the lands outside are divided among and farmed by the people in common. This is the reason we saw no one working alone in the fields. The men, women, and older children all go out together to sow, reap, and bring in the crops. The village authorities fix the times for sowing and reaping. They appoint leaders for the people at work and say just when to begin. The villagers elect their own officers, and as to local matters they govern themselves. They choose their own judges and policemen and can punish wrongdoers. The village assemblies and elections take place in the open air, when the people discuss among themselves all matters relating to their crops and their government. Several such villages constitute a volost, containing about 2,000 householders, each village electing members to the district council, which chooses the officers for the district. The districts of each province in turn send representatives to a provincial assembly composed of not only the peasants, but the nobles as well. All are elected, so you see the Russians largely govern themselves, although the Tsar appoints the governors of the provinces, and his authority is over all. The Russian peasants are very fond of this village system, and a man will not leave his mir, for he does not want to lose his right to the property owned by his village. If he can save money, he can buy lands outside this, but as a rule, the peasants have only the lands which they hold in common. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 34. In St. Petersburg. Stand with me on the dome of St. Isaac's Cathedral and take a look at the great city of St. Petersburg. We have been traveling for days to the northward and are at last in the capital of the Russian Empire, on the Neva River not far from the Baltic. We have driven in our droskies from our hotel down the Nevsky Prospect, the chief street of the city, and along the banks of the Neva to this mighty church. We have climbed around and around up the 500 steps inside its dome, and we now stand on its topmost point, 300 feet above the earth, in one of the most curious cities of the world. Below us, on every side, extends a vast plain of houses, cut up by the great river Neva and the many canals. Off in the distance, at the west, we can see the fortifications of Kronstadt at the mouth of the river on the Gulf of Finland, and in front of us are beautiful islands dotted with the homes of the nobles, while at our back, both to the right and the left, stretches the city. The country about is composed of swamps and morasses. There are great woods and fields to be seen here and there, and everywhere the silvery river and canals sparkle under the rays of the sun. The city is a vast plain of 2, 3, and 4-story houses, built of brick or stone, plastered with yellow stucco, and roofed with iron plates painted dark brown. It is laid out in acute angles, and here, from the dome of St. Isaac's, it looks like an immense crazy quilt of brown diamond-shaped patches sewed together with white streets and tied with knots of white chimneys. What a lot of chimneys! There are hundreds to every square, and every house is dotted with them. St. Petersburg is far to the northward. It is covered with ice and snow throughout the winter, and the sparks fly up those chimneys from November until May. It is so cold that the houses have double windows, and every room has its enormous porcelain stove, such as we saw in Berlin. Notice how solidly the city is built, and what a space each building covers. The Neva is walled with stones, and the great houses seem founded on rocks. They are so large that they cover a mighty area. That crazy quilt is 25 miles in circumference, and many of its block-like patches are as big as a good-sized farm. The vast houses are built in flats or apartments, as in Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, but the rooms are much larger and the buildings cover more space. Here and there we can see a great palace belonging to one of the nobles. That red structure on the banks of the Neva at the end of the Nevsky Prospect is the Winter Palace, where the emperor holds his receptions. It has rooms which are larger than a good-sized house, and its halls are so wide that you could turn a 4-horse wagon load of hay inside them without touching the walls. It has so many rooms that the emperor does not know what is going on in all of them, and it is said that the servants once rented some of them as a stable, and that when a great fire occurred, a cow and a goat were dragged out with the furniture. Now let your eyes run along the Nevsky Prospect. That is the widest avenue of St. Petersburg and its chief business street. Many of the enormous buildings upon it are palaces. Others are stores and great bazaars which are filled with hundreds of merchants. On the opposite side of the Neva you can see immense wholesale houses extending for miles along the quays, while the river and its canals filled with shipping make you think of the views from the tower of the palace in Amsterdam. But what are those immense golden mounds which rise above the buildings in different parts of the city? Some have tall spires painted in the brightest of colors. Those are Russian churches and cathedrals. They are among the grandest of Europe, some having cost many millions of dollars. Notice this church of St. Isaac's upon which we are standing. Its dome is almost as big as that of the Capitol at Washington, and it is made of copper plated with gold. It took 200 pounds of solid gold to cover it, and the cathedral itself has cost about $20 million. Let us descend and go through the church. It is like walking through a museum. It has so many beautiful things in marble, precious stones, and gold carvings. The cathedral floor covers almost 2 acres. It is of many colored marbles, and the walls are of marble inlaid with gold carvings. Only a rich man in America can own a table of malachite, and we sometimes see jewel boxes and breastpins of that precious stone. In St. Isaac's, on the 2 sides of the altar, there are 8 columns of malachite, each as high as a 3-story house. There are also 2 pillars of lapis lazuli, while the fence about the altar is of golden posts set into a railing of the purest white marble. The Kazan Cathedral, not far away, has a balustrade of solid silver about its altar, while the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul blazes with gold, and its mighty golden spire can be seen for miles around. There are scores of other churches here in St. Petersburg. There are chapels in all parts of the city, and it is the same in the other great cities of Russia. Wherever we go, all over the country, we shall find churches and chapels. The Russians are very religious. It is the same in the large towns as we found in the villages. Every man has a picture of the Savior, of the Virgin Mary, or of a saint in his house, and every person crosses himself and says his prayers many times a day. The chief religion of Russia is that of the Greek Orthodox Church. The emperor himself is the head of the church, and there are priests by the thousands all over the country. They dress in black gowns, wear their hair long, and have high caps on their heads. They are appointed by the emperor in connection with the Holy Synod, which aids him in managing the church. There are, however, other churches in Russia, for the empire is so vast that it has all sorts of religions. It has many Roman Catholics, and in Finland many Lutherans. There are numerous Mohammedans along the Volga and in southern Russia, and hundreds of thousands of Jews in western Russia and Poland, Chinese Confucianists and Buddhists in the east, and in the Caucasus Mountains there are many Armenians. From St. Isaac's Cathedral we take droskies and drive to the great government buildings. Some of them are larger than the biggest apartment buildings of Washington, and as we ride on through one magnificent street after another, we are more and more amazed at the solidity of the great Russian capital. And still St. Petersburg is built on a swamp. Its very existence is an evidence of the strength of character of the Russians. The other great capitals we have seen have arisen largely from commercial and manufacturing reasons growing out of their situation. London is at the head of navigation of the Thames. Paris is on the Seine in the center of manufacturing and commercial France. Venice grew up on account of the shipping trade of the Adriatic, and Amsterdam and Rotterdam were built up because they were the commercial centers of the seafaring Dutch nation. St. Petersburg was formed at the command of Peter the Great by a people who lived far away from it in the interior and who had no reason for building it except the command of their ruler. Peter the Great had traveled through the different countries of Europe in order to study how he might better govern his people and make the most of the great Russian Empire. He visited Holland and England and other countries where he saw how the seaports helped build up a nation and how valuable the navy was for its defense. While away he learned shipbuilding, and he came back determined that his country must have both a seaport and a great navy. He could not start his men of war out from the Black Sea because he was shut off by Turkey, which held then and still holds the Bosporus, the only passage out to the Mediterranean. The lands along the Arctic Ocean were too far away and too cold, and so he chose this place on the Gulf of Finland at the mouth of the Neva. He was not alarmed because it was swampy, nor did he fear because it was covered with woods. He said to himself, "Here I will erect my seaport and my capital." Peter's command went forth, and at his word, like magic, this great stone city sprang into being. Piles by the millions were driven down to make the foundation. The river Neva was held back by walls of granite, and every Russian subject was called upon to do something to build the new capital. Every noble in the land was ordered to build a house in St. Petersburg, and every Russian who owned 500 serfs had to put up a two-story house, no matter whether he lived on the edge of the Caspian Sea or on the border of the Ural Mountains. Every vessel on the Russian rivers and every Russian ship on the Baltic had to bring a load of stones to aid in building the city, and all the peasants nearby were ordered to help. 40,000 men were drafted every year to aid in the work, and nobles as well as peasants dug out the foundations and built up the houses. Even the criminals from prisons were made to toil here under the guns of the guards, and through it all the emperor lived in a little house by the river and watch the building. This house still stands, and we drive across the Neva to see it. It is so small that it would hardly be noticed if it were placed in the great ballroom of the Winter Palace. It contains 2 rooms and a kitchen, and is not unlike one of the cabins of our forests of Wisconsin and Michigan. The Russians reverence it as the home of their great emperor, and they have built another house over it, that it may withstand the weather. As we walk through it, we can hardly realize that when it was built, less than 200 years ago, the wolves howled in the woods all about it, and that now more than 100 million people look upon it as the chief place upon earth. Leaving this lowly hut, we again cross the Neva to visit the palaces and government departments and learn more about the Russia of today. We find that the emperor has still nominally almost as much power as had Peter the Great, although in reality he rules largely through his cabinet ministers and state council representing the provinces. We have learned that there are 79 states in the Russian Empire, each of which has some officials appointed by the Tsar, but most of which are more largely ruled by the people themselves. We learn that the empire contains the enormous number of about 130 million people, and of these more than 100 millions live in Russia. The European Russians are chiefly of the Slav race, but there are many other races in different parts of the country, and more than 30 different peoples in the Caucasus alone. At the War and Navy departments we are shown that the Russians have a great navy, and that their army is one of the strongest of the world. And at other offices are told that the government is doing its best to develop the enormous natural resources of the empire by building railroads, opening mines, and encouraging the people in all sorts of manufacture and trade. Russia is also rapidly developing its vast possessions outside Europe. Railroads are building in Siberia and Central Asia, which have opened up rich territories in that continent. Mines of gold, silver, iron, and coal are being worked, and vast tracts of grain and cotton are cultivated. Many thousand Russian peasants emigrate to these countries every year, so that in time much of Asia will be populated by the Slav race. We make excursions north into Finland, traveling through the woods by hundreds of beautiful lakes, and also along the coast, where there are fjords like those of Scandinavia. The inhabitants remind us of the Swedes, although there are some people in the extreme north, known as Finns, who are of the yellow race. The people, Finlanders, everywhere are different from the Russians, although they are ruled by the Tsar, who has the title of the Grand Duke of Finland. They have a senate at Helsingfors, where they make their own laws and have to some extent a government of their own. The Finlanders are chiefly farmers, dairymen, and lumbermen. They are far more thrifty and better educated than the Russians. They have neat villages made of log cabins, and some fine cities such as Helsingfors, the capital, which lies on the Gulf of Finland, having an excellent harbor. Another trip takes us to Warsaw on the Vistula in Russian Poland. Here the inhabitants are almost all Poles. They are a high-spirited people who for a long time had a kingdom of their own. They had some of the best lands of Europe, but the Russians and Prussians, who coveted their property, made war upon them and conquered them, and divided up Poland, so that Russia now has here a state about as large as New York, with a soil fully as rich. The Poles still keep their own language and customs, but they are ruled by the Tsar. They have many large towns, Warsaw being the third city in size of the whole Russian Empire. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 35, Moscow, Commercial and Manufacturing Russia. A day's ride from Warsaw has brought us to Moscow, the commercial capital of the great Russian Empire. The city stands right in the heart of European Russia on the navigable Moscow River, which connects it with the Oka and Volga. It has easy access by rail to the Don, Dnieper, and Dwina rivers, and it is so situated that it is the chief railroad center of Russia. It is in the most densely populated part of the empire, and its situation especially fits it for the center of Russian manufacture and trade. It has more than 1,000 factories in and about it, and the smokestacks rise here and there above the city, rivaling in height the golden spires of its churches. The factories employ more than 250,000 workmen and turn out a product worth several $100 million per year. A great quantity of goods of all kinds is required to supply the vast population of Russia, and the factories are rapidly growing in number. There are now more than 100,000 in the empire, and more are being built. There are many cotton, linen, woolen, and flour mills in Russian Poland. There are factories of all kinds in St. Petersburg, and also in Odessa, and along the Volga River, while there are many little silk mills in the Caucasus Mountains. Not far south of Moscow is Tula, the Sheffield of Russia, where are the great gun factories which supply the Russian army, and enormous railroad shops and works for making knives, tools, and machinery. In Moscow there are vast cotton mills, sugar mills, and establishments which turn out almost everything made of wood, iron, and steel. The chief workshops of Russia, however, are in the homes of the people, the product made there annually amounting in value to more than $500 million. 6/7 of all the goods made are the result of such house industry, for the peasants are everywhere working at their trades in their homes. Nearly every Russian village has its specialty. In some the people spin yarn and weave cloth, and in others they make boots and shoes. There are towns along the Volga which turn out fine axes and knives. Just outside Moscow is a village whose people are noted for beating gold leaf, while near Tula there are 2,000 people who work away in their little houses making accordions. In southern Russia, rugs and carpets as beautiful as those of India and Turkey are woven by hand, and in central Russia there are many thousands who paint icons or pictures of saints, such as we have seen in the houses and stores with candles and incense burning below them. These icons are cut out of plates of carved gold, silver, or brass, only the faces being painted. They are of all sizes and prices, from little ones no bigger than a watch, which sell for a few cents, up to some as big as a barn door, worth thousands of dollars. There are stores in Moscow which sell nothing else, and we can find icon stores in all the large cities. There are some villages in Russia where the people make a business of raising canaries for sale, and some where they raise cats for their skins. The cats bring 5 or 10 cents apiece. They are bought by traveling merchants who ship their skins to the fur markets of the empire. In other villages pigeons are bred for their skins, which are cured with the feathers on and sold at the fairs to be exported to all parts of Europe and our country for decorating ladies' hats and lining fine cloaks. You have all heard of Russian leather. It is prized everywhere for pocketbooks, valises, slippers, and bookbindings. It has a delightful odor from the birch bark employed by the tanners. Much of it is made in small tanneries, and there are hundreds of thousands engaged at their homes making various articles from it, both for export and for sale to the Russians. In some parts of the empire, the women wear high boots of soft leather, and every Russian man who can afford it has at least one pair of boots which come up to his knees. There are thousands of women who knit beautiful lace, and Russian velvets are noted all over Europe. The Russians are skillful in making all sorts of things, and some day, when machinery has taken the place of hand labor, they will be one of the greatest of the manufacturing nations. The empire has vast deposits of gold and silver, and of coal, iron, and copper. It has more wood than any other European country. It raises quantities of wool and flax and tobacco, and also in Asia a great deal of cotton, so that it has all the materials for a great manufacturing country. Until a few years ago, the most of the Russian peasants were practically in slavery, and all sorts of work were done in the rudest way. Now the people are introducing modern inventions, and they are establishing large factories with the finest machinery. They are opening up their mines both in Europe and Asia. The government is encouraging improved methods of farming, and the education of the people has begun. They are rapidly growing in intelligence and wealth, and they will continue to grow. Many believe that the two greatest nations of the world of the future will be the Russians and the Americans. But let us take a stroll through the business sections of Moscow. We shall find them different from those of the other great cities we have seen, for Russia is in some respects more like Asia than Europe or the United States. Here we are, in one of the great bazaars which we find in all Russian cities. It is a vast building covering many acres, filled with all sorts of shops, opening out into covered corridors or arcades, so that there are hundreds upon hundreds of stores under one roof. This one bazaar has 1,200 stores. It is a whole town of stores roofed over, and the stores are of all kinds, so that you can buy anything you want, from a slate pencil to a sealskin coat, or from a toothpick to a set of furniture. There are jewelry shops and clothing stores, stores selling leather goods, and stores which deal only in pictures and books. We wander through one arcaded street after another, past beautiful things of all kinds and some of great value, realizing as we do so that Russia must have a large class of rich people to buy goods so very expensive. We are also surprised at the way they do business. When we attempt to purchase, the merchant usually charges us more than he expects to receive, and we must bargain with him if we would pay only a fair price. The result is that we offset his price by an offer of much less, whereupon he comes down a little. We then go up a few cents, and if we hold out, we at last get it perhaps for what we are willing to give. The business hours in the bazaars are from 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. We visit them one day about shutting up time and watch the merchants lock up for the night. Each store facing the street has windows and doors, which are closed tight and then fastened with padlocks. The merchant turns the key and then ties the padlock to the staple, sealing the two ends of the string with hot wax, into which he presses his stamp, so that the store cannot possibly be opened without breaking the seal. He then stands in front of the closed doors and crosses himself, saying a prayer before he leaves for the night. He will probably say another when he opens his shop in the morning. Outside the bazaars there are many stores scattered over the city, some of which have curious signs. They have pictures painted on the walls facing the street, which show what articles are sold within, so that those who cannot read may understand from the pictures. Take, for instance, that barber sign over there on the opposite side of the street. The whole wall of the shop is covered with it. One part of it represents a man in his shirt sleeves shaving a customer, while opposite him is a lady holding out her arm from which a stream of blood is spouting, while a man stands beside her with a knife in his hand. Farther down in the picture sits a boy having a tooth pulled, and the whole sign shows us that the man within is not only a barber, but a dentist and surgeon as well. That store farther on is a feed store. There is a bundle of hay in the doorway, and on the walls at the sides are pictures of horses and cows feeding and grazing. The tea signs represent Chinamen sipping tea, while the dairy signs are pictures of cows with maids milking them. We visit the markets before going back to our hotel. They are of enormous extent and are filled with the finest of game, meats, fish, and vegetables. The better class Russians are noted for their extravagant living, and the markets of St. Petersburg and Moscow are as good as those of any other European city. Fish may be bought alive. They are kept in stone vats of running water, each filled with its own kind of fish. In the dining rooms of some of the great restaurants there are marble fountains with fishes swimming about in them. You can point out the fish you want for your supper, and the waiter will catch it in a net and cook it for you, and I am sure you will say it is the best fish you ever ate. Russia is noted for fine fish, and it exports quantities of fish and fish eggs every year. The Volga, the Caspian Sea, and the Black Sea have rich fishing grounds, and there are fisheries along the Arctic Ocean and the Baltic Sea. In the markets we see cans, buckets, and tubs of caviar. This is a Russian dainty made of the roe of the sturgeon. Caviar looks like birdshot, but it is in reality the eggs of the sturgeon, which are eaten in great quantities by the people throughout Russia. The fresh caviar is the best, but a great deal of it is canned and thus sold all over the world. After the eggs have been removed, the sturgeon meat is salted, and you can buy it in the market at about 10 cents a pound. There are also stalls where only dried fish is sold. This is eaten by the people everywhere, and it forms a part of the diet of the peasants. The queerest market sights are those of the winter, when almost everything is sold in a frozen state. The Russian winter is so cold that fish and meats can easily be kept frozen for months. The butcher can lay away his beef, mutton, and chickens in October and bring them forth at any time during the winter. The meats are frozen so hard that a knife will not cut them, and they have to be sawed or chopped up with an axe, when it is said splinters of meat fly about in every direction, and the beggars collect them and take them off home. Leaving the markets, we go back to our hotel. It is an enormous structure, having a dining room so large that 1,000 people can be seated in it at one time. The food is excellent, and we find that we can live as well in Moscow as in any other city we have visited. The customs of eating, however, are different from those of the other European countries. The first thing the Russian does upon entering the dining room is to go to a lunch counter, which is always found at one side of the room, where vodka, a Russian liquor, and such relishes as caviar, raw herring, smoked salmon, radishes, butter, and cheese are laid out. He drinks a small glass of the vodka and eats a bit of a relish while standing, and then goes and takes his seat for dinner. The first thing that is served at a regular dinner is soup, and we find the ordinary dish of Russian soup almost a whole meal. One of the most popular kinds is known as stitchy. Sneeze hard and you will get the right pronunciation. Stitchy is made of cabbage and beef, to which is often added a bowl of sour cream. Each plateful of the soup has a big chunk of beef in the middle, and we are expected first to eat the soup and then to cut up the beef and eat it. There are other soups of all kinds, hot and cold. There is even iced soup, as we discover when we lunch one day at a restaurant. We cannot read Russian and point to the odd letters where the word soup should be on the bill of fare, and ask the waiter for that. He goes to the kitchen and brings a great bowl of white liquid with a piece of ice as big as his fist floating about in it. We try it. It tastes like iced vinegar, and one taste is enough. After the soup, meat and vegetables of various kinds are brought on, and then most delicious desserts. The Russian bread and butter at the better hotels is always good. Leaving the markets, we take droskies and ride about Moscow. It is built upon the hills and hollows which here line the winding Moscow River. It is 25 miles in circumference, and the shortest car line from one side of it to the other is 9 miles long. In the very center of the city is a great fortress or citadel known as the Kremlin, which contains the old palace of the Tsar, several famous Russian churches, the cathedral in which the emperors of Russia are crowned, and the tall tower of Ivan the Great. The tower is 5 stories high, and its golden dome seems to float in the air away up there 300 feet above the ground. There is a stairway in it, and we climb up 450 steps to the top for a view of the city. We are hanging over a vast expanse of trees and houses, out of which rise the golden spires and domes of hundreds of churches. There are thousands of green trees. The roofs of the houses are all painted green, while some of the church domes are of sky blue, spotted with stars of gold. On the opposite side of the river, we can see the golden dome of the Church of Our Savior, and beyond the city the smokestacks of the factories, while just under us is the great triangular walled space known as the Kremlin. It is paved with cobblestones, and its massive wall is entered by 5 gates, each of which has a history. There is the one through which we came. It is called the Gate of the Redeemer, on account of a picture of the Savior above it, and every one, from the Tsar to the peasant, takes off his hat to that picture as he goes through. Every inch of land within the walls of the Kremlin is historic and sacred. In the church below us all the Tsars of Russia have been crowned, and there to the left is the imperial treasury, where are the jewels and the costly plate belonging to the Russian crown. There are hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold and precious stones in that building. There are basins of gold as big as a footbath, some of the world's greatest diamonds, and 2 tables of solid silver. As we go down from the tower of Ivan the Great, we pass the many bells for which it is noted. Russia is a land of bells, and there are said to be 2,000 in Moscow alone. The largest bell that rings, so large that you cannot get it into an ordinary parlor, hangs within the tower, and there are others, some of which are made of solid silver, but of smaller size. As we come out of the tower, we see at its foot, on a pedestal of stone, the biggest bell ever made. It is as tall as a 2-story house, is 55 feet in circumference and 2 feet in thickness. A piece taller than a man is broken out of its side, and when we climb up and crawl into the hole where this piece once was, we are in a great tent of bronze. This bell was first cast in the 16th century and was hung in Ivan's tower. The tower burned, and when the bell fell, it was broken in pieces. It was cast again in a larger size, but when the metal was still molten, the women of Moscow, in a religious frenzy, threw their jewelry into the mass, and this rendered it so imperfect that when it was rung a great piece broke out of its side. Then there was another fire, and the bell fell once more, never to rise again. From the Kremlin we visit the great church of Our Savior, built to commemorate the deliverance of Moscow when the French soldiers under Napoleon invaded the country. The church cost about $40 million, or about 3 times as much as our capital at Washington. Later on we spend some time in the Moscow University, which was founded by Peter the Great and which is now several thousand students. We next drive out to the People's Park and enjoy ourselves with the Russian children in the roller coasters and merry-go-rounds. We listen to the open-air concerts and drink our tea under the trees. We find that the Russians are fond of enjoyment and pleasure. They have shows of all kinds, and their musicians are among the best of the world. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 36. Down the Volga to the Caspian Sea. We are at Nizhny Novgorod on the river Volga. We have come from Moscow by train and are now on a bluff overlooking the Volga at the point where the Oka flows into it. Above us upon a hill is a great fortress, and behind and about us a city with fine streets, many stores and churches, and large public buildings. It contains 100,000 people, and the noise of its business and traffic makes a din in our ears. Below, on the tongue of land formed by the junction of the Volga and Oka, is another city almost as large, but strange to say, as quiet and deserted as a city of the dead. We cannot see a wreath of smoke coming from its thousands of chimneys. Its many stores are closed, and their shelves have no goods on them. It has theaters, but no actors. Its electric lights have not shone for months, and the grass is growing in its streets. It is the fair city of Nizhny Novgorod, which for about a month in late summer is one of the liveliest trading places in the whole world, but which for the rest of the year is deserted and dead. In the Middle Ages, the most of the business of Europe was done in great fairs held at all the principal centers, and visited by buyers and sellers from everywhere. These fairs were usually held once a year, and they often lasted for weeks. They were established because there were but few large cities with stores of all kinds such as are found in Europe today. Most of the people lived in villages, as they still do in Russia. There were no railroads, and but few good wagon roads, and no way of moving rapidly about upon the rivers, so that the people could not go often from one place to another to buy or sell goods. As the means of communication improved and the cities grew, the fairs passed away, but there are still a number in Russia, and now and then one in other parts of Europe, such as Leipzig, where we heard of the book fairs and fur fairs which are still held every year. The principal fair of Russia meets annually in that deserted city below us. Those houses have been built for it. They contain more than 6,000 shops, which a month or so hence will be filled with goods. There will be more than 6,000 merchants selling them, and many, many thousands of purchasers. Then the banks of the Volga for 10 miles above here will be covered with merchandise, and both the Volga and Oka will be crowded with shipping. Vessels from the Caspian Sea will bring raw cotton from Central Asia, and bales of fine wool from South Russia, as well as carpets, rugs, silks, and other such things. Barges of pig iron from Siberia will be floated down from the Ural Mountains, and great loads of brick tea will be carried on camels over the highlands from China. Every variety of goods made in the thousands of factories of Russia will be brought hither, as well as skins, furs, fish, sugar, coffee, rice, and in short almost everything that is made anywhere. Most of the business will be at wholesale, and a vast deal of money will change hands. The customers will be of all the nations and races of Eastern Europe and Southern and Western Asia. One section of the city will be given up to the Chinese, another to the Persians and Turks, and others to the Russians. There will be Georgians and Circassians, Armenians and Romanians, Germans and Hungarians, and merchants from every part of the Russian Empire. There will in all be several 100,000 strangers in the great fair city, and we regret we cannot stay for the sight. We have time for only a drive through the now deserted streets, after which we take the steamer for our long ride down the Volga to the Caspian Sea. How interesting it is! We have steamed out of Nizhny Novgorod and are now moving southward upon the greatest river of Europe. The Volga is 2,300 miles long, and is navigable almost all the way from its source to its mouth. It is one of the great trade routes of Russia, and one of the commercial waterways of the world, including, with its tributaries, more than 7,000 miles of navigable waterways. It is connected by canal with the Neva, so that boats and barges from the Baltic can be taken through that river and the canal into the Volga and carried on down to the Caspian Sea. It has other canals which connect it with the Dwina and the Arctic Ocean, and one joining the Oka to the Don, by which goods can be taken from the Volga up the Oka into the Don and the Black Sea. The river is winding and the scene continually changes. Now we are going north and now south. Now the stream widens, so that we seem to be steaming through a great lake, and now it is narrow and deep with high rugged banks. One day we have a storm, and the water changes from silver to ink, while the winds from the plain sweep in gusts over our vessel. The storm passes and the sun sets in a blaze of red in the western horizon. Every few miles we pass a large village of log huts, and now and then go by a city. There are 40 large cities on the Volga, and more than 1,000 towns and villages. We see many windmills, and everywhere above the towns the spires and domes of the churches. Our first long stay is at Kazan, which we reach about a day and a night after leaving Nizhny Novgorod. It is one of the oldest cities of Russia, having been the capital of the Tartars, when those almond-eyed yellow savages overran Eastern Europe and for 200 years fought for the country with the Slavs. They were finally conquered by the Russians under Ivan the Terrible, but many of the Tartars remained in Kazan, and there are thousands of Tartars in it today. There are 3 now in that crowd on the wharf. You can tell them by their yellow faces and slant eyes. They have caps of black astrakhan fur, and their heads are shaved close, while the Russians have caps with visors and wear their hair long. Farther back is a group of Tartar women. They are queer-looking creatures with sacks over their heads. The Tartars are good Mohammedans, and Mohammedan women seldom show their faces to any men but their husbands. The country is densely populated, and we see children everywhere. Farther down the river we spend an hour in Samara, a large city with many windmills about it, and stop again farther on at Saratov, in a grain-growing region. Everywhere we see rich crops of wheat, barley, and rye. There are miles upon miles of pastures, herds of cattle and horses, and great flocks of sheep, and vast tracts of sunflowers with their great golden blossoms swaying to and fro in the wind. The Russians raise sunflowers for their seeds, and they consider them a very profitable crop. The seeds, when pressed, yield a rich oil which is used for salads and cooking, and also for lighting and making candles and soap. The refuse of the seeds, after the oil is squeezed out, is an excellent food for pigs, cattle, and sheep, and also for rabbits, pigeons, and poultry. The people eat the seeds as we do peanuts, keeping a handful or so in their pockets and nibbling away on them from time to time. There is such a demand for the seeds for various purposes that more than 40 million pounds of them are raised every year. The flowers are rich in honey, and the farmers keep bees which feed upon them. A yellow dye is made from the blossoms, and the stalks have a fiber which the people in some districts use as we do flax. We ask how the sunflowers are raised, and are told that the seeds are sown very late in the fall or in the early spring and harvested in the summer. The seed is drilled in rows about 18 inches apart, and the plants thinned out so that there is a space of a foot or so between them. An acre of plants should yield about 50 bushels of seed. We are interested in the shipping of the Volga. The river is filled with vessels from Nizhny Novgorod to the sea. We go by many passenger steamers, past great barges loaded with grain, and tank ships of petroleum on their way from the oil fields below the Caucasus Mountains to the railroads and factories of the north. We pass enormous rafts of lumber, each with a neat house upon it, where the lumbermen live during the voyage. The rafts come from the northern forests, where the timber was cut, and the lumbermen will sell both timber and houses when they reach their destination in one of the towns of the treeless plains farther downstream. Nearer the shore are small boats towed along from the banks by horses and by red-shirted peasants. There are fishing boats here and there, and other craft of every description. We are more than 4 days on the river before we reach Astrakhan, at the head of the delta of the Volga, where it divides into about 200 mouths and flows on to the Caspian Sea. Here the river is wide. Its volume increases with the floods of the spring, when it becomes a great sea, from 10 to 25 miles broad, for hundreds of miles from its mouth. Even here the Volga is frozen for 3 months, and above Nizhny Novgorod it is covered with ice for 5 or 6 months every year. Astrakhan is the chief port for the Caspian Sea, although it is situated about 80 miles north of it. It is a very old city, largely inhabited by the fishermen of the Caspian, and having a vast trade in fish as well as in wool and other products of the region about it. We visit the establishments where they are putting up caviar for export, and then take steamer for Baku, the chief port of the Russian oil regions on the Caspian Sea. It takes us all day to get to the mouth of the Volga, and we are more than another day in sailing on to Baku. The Caspian is rough, for a storm rises when we are far out from land, and in our little vessel we are rolled about more than we were during our passage across the Atlantic. The Caspian is the largest of all inland seas, and the winds from the Russian steppes roll up immense billows upon it. The water is salt, and the spray which is dashed in our faces makes us think of the ocean. We are now 90 feet below the surface of the Black Sea, which we left at Odessa, and as we near Baku, we are in sight of the Caucasus Mountains, the southern boundary of European Russia. When we leave the steamer, we step out onto the soil of Asia, but as the oil fields are closely associated with European Russia, we have decided to include them in our tour. They begin at Baku. The strip in which they are found is only a few miles in width, but it is more than 1,000 miles long. We seem to be steaming through oil as we come into the harbor. The water is coated with it, and there is a strong smell of petroleum from the great tank ships, and from the trains of tank cars, as well as from the pipes which bring the oil into the city. We ask for a drink of fresh water, and when it is brought we taste it and then hand it back in disgust, for it has the flavor of kerosene. In Baku, much of the cooking is done with oil, and the factories use oil for fuel. The city for a long time was lighted with oil, and everything we see seems mixed with it. The train which carries us through the oil region burns petroleum. We ride for miles through a forest of black towers 60 feet high, each standing above an oil well, and when at last we get out of the cars and walk on the ground, the oil oozes out under our feet. The scenes are somewhat like those of the oil regions of the United States, save that instead of the skeleton-like derricks which stand over our wells, we have here towers like pyramids, boarded up, and as black as though they were covered with pitch. At each tower is a shed for the engine used for boring the well, also for pumping oil. The black on the tower has come from the oil and sand which spouted forth from the well when the oil was first struck. The petroleum of this part of the world is nearer the surface than in our oil fields. Some of the wells are only 200 feet deep, and many are less than 1,000 feet deep. When a good well is first struck, the oil often bursts forth to a great height, falling in a dense shower all about. Sometimes so much oil comes from the fountain wells that it is impossible to save it, and it flows off in streams over the land. Ditches are then dug to carry it to the reservoirs, and we see streams of oil, ponds of oil, and great tanks of oil everywhere. From one well bored some years ago, the oil sprouted up to the height of 400 feet, and it kept spouting for months, so that within less than 2 years it produced enough petroleum to fill a ditch more than a yard wide and 100 miles long, and deep enough to cover the head of a man standing upright within it. As we proceed, we see more and more evidences of the great extent of the Russian oil fields. There are 500 ships on the Caspian Sea which carry nothing but oil. Vast amounts are shipped to Russia and other parts of Europe, and trains of tank cars are always carrying petroleum and kerosene to the Black Sea. From there it is shipped through the Strait of the Bosporus and the Mediterranean Sea to Asia, Africa, South America, and Europe. The United States now sells more oil than any other country, but Russia is competing with it in the markets of the world. And as we ride on through these forests of black towers, we wonder whether Russia may not at some time surpass the United States in exporting petroleum. From the oil regions we take a train for Tiflis, the capital of the Russian dominions in Transcaucasia, a territory which is as large as France and which contains more than 8 million people. The city is a beautiful one of about 200,000 inhabitants. It lies in a valley with vineyards about it, with rocky heights farther back and with many snow-clad peaks far off in the distance. We are now in the heart of the Caucasus Mountains, but on the lower side of the range, and quite a long way from Mount Elburz, the highest of these mountains, and also the highest mountain of Europe. The people of Tiflis are chiefly Asiatics. We see many strange faces and costumes as we ride about the town and shop in the bazaars, and we feel that we might linger for weeks here in Asia had we not a large part of Europe yet to explore. We visit the different quarters of the city, buy a few things of the Persian, Turkish, and Armenian merchants in the markets, and then take the train through the Caucasus to Batum on the Black Sea, where we find a ship which within a few days will land us in Constantinople, the capital of Turkey. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Geographical Reader, Europe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. Chapter 37. In Constantinople. The Strait of the Bosporus, which connects the Big Black Sea with the Little Sea of Marmora and the Mediterranean, winds in and out through a deep mountain valley which here lies between Europe and Asia. The hills in some places slope almost precipitously down to the water, and in other places great cliffs overhang it. Here and there along the strait are the palaces of the Sultan and of Turkish nobles, interspersed with fishermen's huts and peasant villages, with rich farms and forests. There are castles and fortresses on some of the hills, and the scenery often reminds us of the Rhine and the Danube. The Bosporus is one of the great water highways between Europe and Asia, and vast cargoes of grain, oil, wool, and other products are always passing back and forth through it. The strait is only 19 miles long, but so wide and deep that the largest ocean steamers can easily navigate it. At the southern end of the strait, where it empties into the Sea of Marmora, there is a lofty little peninsula, a tongue of land extending far out and almost blocking the entrance. The northern side of this peninsula is bordered by a horn-shaped inlet, which forms a wide and deep harbor, so covered with rich shipping that it is called the Golden Horn. The peninsula itself is not much larger than a big Texas farm, but it is the site of Constantinople, one of the most beautiful cities of the world. We have learned that there is always a reason for cities being situated just where they are. Even as villages are built at country crossroads to catch the business of the people moving each way, so cities grow up on the great highways of commerce, and especially where such highways cross. This is one of the reasons for the growth of Constantinople. It is at the chief crossroads of Europe and Asia. The grand divisions here come close together, and goods brought in by caravan for Europe can be easily shipped over the narrow strait to Constantinople, from where they can be sent on to the northward. Moreover, Constantinople occupies the best position on the great water road of the Bosporus, which connects the whole world with the Black Sea and all parts of Eastern Europe. The Golden Horn gives Constantinople an excellent harbor, and its situation at the mouth of the Bosporus makes it really the chief port of the Danube, the Dnieper, the Don, and the other great rivers which empty into the Black Sea, and as such it has always had a great trade. The city also has the advantage of being easily defended. There are highlands about it upon which are great fortifications, and forts have been erected along the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, so that the Turks can, if they wish, prevent ships from moving out and in through the strait. The site of Constantinople is so central that a city was founded here more than 2,500 years ago, under the name of Byzantium, which for centuries was a center of commerce and trade. About 1,000 years later, the Emperor Constantine made it the capital of the whole Roman Empire, and called it Constantinople. For many centuries it was a Roman city. Then it was taken by the Crusaders, and in the Middle Ages by the Mohammedan Turks. A few years before Columbus started out on his first voyage to America, the Turks, a yellow race of Tartar Mohammedans who had overrun Asia Minor, captured the city and extended their conquests farther on into Europe, taking country after country along the Danube and elsewhere, until they had almost as much territory as there is in the German Empire of today. They had still larger possessions in Asia than in Europe, but they so liked Constantinople that they chose it for the capital of their empire, and it holds this position today, although the greater part of their European territories have been taken from them. But we are now at the end of the Bosporus, right in front of the city. Our ship is slowly steaming in and out among craft of all kinds. The Golden Horn in front of us is filled with vessels of every description, and there are hundreds of little caiques, or Turkish gondolas, containing passengers and pleasure hunters moving in all directions. Steam launches and tugs are darting in and out through the shipping. The boats are manned by queerly dressed sailors, and all our surroundings are strange. We are on the water, but nevertheless almost in the midst of the great city of Constantinople. There on the right bank of the Golden Horn are the marble palaces of the Sultan, some high up on the hill and others on the edge of the water, while farther on are the houses and business structures of Pera, where the most of the Europeans live. At the left, on the opposite bank of the Bosporus, a village of pink houses of curious shapes rises out of green trees. That land is Asia, and the town is Scutari, the suburb of Constantinople, where the largest of the Turkish cemeteries is located, and where many Turks who do business in Constantinople live. Before us on the peninsula is spread out the main part of the city, known as Stambul, which contains the vast bazaars, the hundreds of mosques, and the dwellings of most of the million and more who make up the population of this great Turkish capital. As we come closer, the city appears to rise straight up from the sea. There is a low, ruined wall about it, built centuries ago, but back of this are palaces, here and there on the edge of the water, surrounded by green. The city is made up of hill and hollow, and as it lies before us it is a vast rolling expanse of houses, with huge domes and tall white towers extending high above them. Each of those domes is on the roof of one of the great Mohammedan churches or mosques, some of which cover acres, and the white towers are their minarets. The minarets have galleries about them in which, with our glasses, we can see dark-faced men in turbans and gowns standing as they call the people to prayer. We can hear their shrill tenor voices coming over the water, and we see the Mohammedans on our ship turn toward the south in the direction of Mecca, their holy city, and kneel down and bend their heads to the deck as they utter their prayers. Now we have entered the Golden Horn and landed at Pera. We have walked through the business part of the city and gone down to the bridge of boats, which is the main highway across to Stamboul. We have paid our toll to the tall Turk in turban and gown at the entrance, and are standing on the bridge, gazing at the strange throngs that are moving back and forth on their way to and from the great city. Constantinople is a mixture of many strange races. It has more Turks, perhaps, than any other people, but there are thousands of Armenians, Persians, Circassians, Greeks, Georgians, and Jews, as well as strange characters from all parts of Europe and southwestern Asia. There are scores of men in long gowns with white, red, blue, or green turbans about their heads. They wear red or yellow slippers turned up at the toes, which clap on the boards as they walk. Their faces are dark, and their eyes somewhat slanting. Many have long beards which reach down their breasts. Most of those who dress in this way are Turks, and all are Mohammedans. There are also hundreds of dark-faced men wearing clothes like ours, but with red fez caps on their heads, and there are boys in red caps and long gowns. But what are those two curious creatures now coming toward us? As they enter the bridge in the distance, each looks like two mammoth sausages tied together, one on top of the other. Those are two Turkish women who have their heads and faces so wrapped up that they hardly seem human. Their dresses look like balloons, for their outer clothing hides their forms as they walk through the street. Now they are closer, and we see that each wears a veil, so that only the eyes and a strip of the forehead are visible. One of the women has a black servant with her, a slave who is going along to guard and protect her. Mohammedan women do not show their faces on the street, and indoors they are rarely seen by any other men than their husbands. Get out of the way of that porter. Don't you see the enormous box he is carrying on his back, bending over so that he can hardly look up? He is one of the drays of Constantinople, and he competes with the donkey and the camel for his share of the freight. There are but few heavy vehicles in the city. Trunks and boxes of all kinds are carried about by the porters, called hamals, who rest their burdens on saddles fastened to their backs. Some of them are so strong they can carry as much as 500 pounds at one load. But let us walk over the bridge, keeping close to the railing and out of the way of the carriages, donkeys, and camels, and of the turbaned soldiers riding Arabian horses. We walk behind a Greek priest, who strolls along arm in arm with a Circassian in uniform, wearing a high cap of astrakhan fur. As we go on, we are accosted by beggars in turbans. We pass peddlers and hucksters dressed in all the colors of the rainbow and selling all kinds of goods. We stop one for a drink from a great bottle of lemonade which he carries on his back, and from another we buy some of the Turkish fig paste for which Constantinople is famous. Now we have left the bridge and are making our way through the city. The streets are narrow and winding. They are paved with cobblestones and in many places are dirty and filthy. What a lot of dogs there are everywhere! Many lie asleep on the stones, so that we have to kick them to get them out of our way. They put their tails between their legs and move off growling, for they are poor-spirited curs, and are perhaps the leanest dogs of the world. They excite a pathetic interest, for they have no masters. They belong to the city, and their only homes are the streets. The Turks never think of letting dogs come into their houses, for they consider them unclean, so that although Constantinople has thousands of dogs, no man in the city owns a dog. Each dog has its own quarter, however, and when a stray cur comes into a strange alley, the dogs of the alley pounce upon him and drive him out. The dogs serve as the scavengers, and they seem to be the only street cleaners of Constantinople. But here we are at the bazaars, where we can learn how they do business in this great Mohammedan city. We push our way through the crowds at the entrance and enter a town of stores, all under one roof. There are acres upon acres of little cell-like shops ranged along narrow cobblestone streets, lighted here and there by small domes. Some of the stores are not bigger than packing boxes. Here is one so small that it is entirely filled by the merchant, who sits cross-legged on the floor with his goods piled around him. Other shops are larger, and many are furnished with divans, upon which long-gowned, long-bearded men sit and smoke and drink coffee as they bargain. The floors of some of the stores are as high as a chair, and we sit on the floor with our feet in the street as we shop. All business is done by bargaining, and it takes us a long time to make every purchase. It is customary to find fault with the goods, and at the suggestion of our guide we offer only about one-third the amount that the merchant demands. If he refuses, we come up a few cents, and if he will make no reduction whatever, start away expecting to be called back, as is often the case, although he protests that such sales will ruin his business. There are no fixed prices, and the Turkish dealer takes all he can get. In many of the bazaars, the turbaned storekeeper sends out a servant for coffee, and we drink as we bargain. The coffee is served without cream in a little cup no bigger than half an eggshell. It is as thick as chocolate and almost as sweet as molasses. We are told that it is made of the roasted coffee beans pounded to a fine powder. We grow very fond of it, although it seems more like a sweet syrup than coffee. We devote a long time to the bazaars, strolling about through one narrow street after another. Each section has its own kind of goods. We walk through roofed alleys walled with slippers and shoes of the brightest of colors, and of all grades and prices. There are men's shoes of red leather made without heels and with the toes turned up at the ends like an old-fashioned skate. There are ladies' shoes of fine silk in the most delicate shades of pearl, pink, and sky blue, some of which are covered with gold and silver embroidery. We each buy a pair of children's shoes to take home. They are of red leather with a tassel of wool on each toe as big as a walnut. Under the tassel is a bell, so that some of the little Turks actually go about with bells on their toes. We stay some time in the Persian bazaars, looking at beautiful shawls and other things from that country, buy a fez cap apiece in the fez shops, and in the perfumery section lay in a supply of attar of roses, for this is the land of that delightful perfume. In European Turkey there are vast rose farms, each containing many thousands of bushes. The roses are picked when in full bloom, and from their leaves is extracted an oil, the scent of which is so strong that a drop of it put into a box of clothing will make it smell like roses for weeks. This oil is called attar of roses. Vast quantities of it are sold in Constantinople, and a great deal is exported to other parts of the world. Passing through the spice bazaar, we enter streets where scores of merchants are selling the oriental carpets and rugs for which Turkey is famous. The rugs are made on hand looms by the women and girls in different parts of the empire. The work is done in their homes, and it takes them a long time to make a fine rug. Only a few square inches can be made in one day, and the larger rugs require many months of continuous work. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 38, Among the Mohammedans. Our first business this morning is to learn something of the Turkish Empire and how it is governed. We leave our hotel and go to the Sublime Porte, a vast building which contains the chief public offices of the Sultan. We are met at the door by the guards, one of whom takes us through room after room filled with clerks, each wearing a turban or a red fez cap on his head. Some wear European clothes, and a few have on long gowns like the merchants of the bazaars. The Empire of Turkey is ruled by the Sultan and a parliament of 2 houses, which is elected by the people. The Sultan has a council of ministers much like the cabinet of our president. His chief officer, who has charge of all civil affairs, is called the Grand Vizier, and another very great man is the Sheikh ul Islam, or chief of the church, who has to do with all matters relating to the Mohammedans in Constantinople and throughout the empire. Not only is the Sultan the civil ruler of the Turkish people, but he is the head of the Mohammedan religion, which is professed by more than 100 million people in different parts of the world. The Turkish Empire once included a large part of Asia, Africa, and Europe, but now it covers a territory only about a third as large as the United States. The European possessions of the Turks have for years been steadily decreasing. Country after country has been taken from them by Russia and Austria, and the Sultan is now able to hold Constantinople and his remaining territories north of the Bosporus only by the consent of the great powers who fear Russia and think Europe will be safer from her as long as the entrance to the Black Sea is in the hands of the Turks. All the countries of European Turkey combined are not so large as some of our western states. They now comprise only a part of the Balkan Peninsula, a rich land inhabited by many different peoples, much like those we saw on our trip down the Danube. There are Romanians, Servians, Bulgarians, Slavs, Albanians, Armenians, Gypsies, and a great many Turks. About 1/2 of the whole population is Mohammedan, and of the other half the most belong to the Greek Orthodox Church, which we learned about during our travels in Russia. The people throughout the whole Turkish Empire are poor. The Sultan and his officials prey upon them by demanding large taxes. The laws provide that 1/10 of all the crops shall go to the government, and the officials come out to the harvest fields and carry away their share of the grain. There are also heavy taxes on imports and exports, so that the people cannot save money. Men will not work hard in a country where the government takes the lion's share of the profits. The result is that there are comparatively few industries in Turkey, and the minerals and other resources are but little developed. In European Turkey, the people live chiefly by farming and stock raising. They dwell in villages, having but few large towns, and only about a dozen cities of more than 20,000 inhabitants. The largest city outside Constantinople is Saloniki. It is on the Aegean Sea and has a railroad connection with other parts of Europe. It has an excellent harbor and is becoming a commercial port, as it is on the shortest sea route from London to the Suez Canal. Another important city is Adrianople, situated where the road from Constantinople to Vienna crosses that from Bulgaria to the sea. It is also the center of the rose-growing industry, where the attar of roses we bought in the bazaar is made. We observe that education is backward in Turkey. The chief teachers are the Mohammedan priests, and the schools are largely connected with the mosques, or Mohammedan churches. Very few of the cities have any modern improvements, and everything is somewhat Asiatic. European Turkey is a Mohammedan country, ruled by Mohammedans, and all of our surroundings show the evil effects that Mohammedanism has upon the people and their advancement in civilization and wealth. But let us go to the mosques and see something of this interesting religion, which is professed by about 1/15 of the population of the globe. There are more than 2,000 mosques in the Turkish Empire, and about 300 of the finest of them are in Constantinople. Our first visit is to Santa Sophia, the largest mosque of the world. It was built as a Christian church centuries ago. 10,000 masons worked upon it for 7 years, and 100 architects were required to oversee its construction. It had doors of ivory, amber, and cedar, and its altar was made of precious stones embedded in gold. The finest temples of Ephesus, Thebes, Athens, and Rome were robbed of columns in order to decorate it, and it was a huge mass of precious marbles, gold, and jewels. When the Turks conquered Constantinople, they destroyed much of its beauty. They defaced the paintings and tore down the altars and turned it into a mosque. Nevertheless, it is still one of the most interesting of the world's churches and one of the largest. It covers almost as much ground as the Capitol at Washington, being built in the shape of a Greek cross. It is covered with a vast roof upheld by a forest of columns with a grand dome in the center. But let us go in and see for ourselves. We shall first enter the court. There are turbaned, long-gowned Turks guarding the doors, and we are asked to take off our shoes. For the Mohammedans consider their churches holy, and no one is permitted to enter them with his shoes on. There are fountains in the court, and about them are hundreds of Turks washing themselves before they go in to pray. The good Mohammedan prays 5 times every day, and he washes his face, hands, and feet before every prayer. We walk through corridor after corridor of the great mosque, and later attend one of the evening services, held in the light of its thousands of lamps. We stand in the galleries above great stars of flame, which seem to be floating in the air between the dome and the floor. Every pillar and every alcove is ablaze, and the galleries are walled with fire. The service has already begun when we enter the building. The floor below us is covered with worshippers. There are at least 5,000 Mohammedans on their knees, with their faces toward Mecca, on the floor below us. In turbans and gowns, with their shoes in front of them, and their bare feet turned up to the gallery, they form long lines of color upon the white mats away down there under the floating flames. They are all praying in response to the shrill cries of the imam, or priest, who stands in the pulpit at one end of the vast church and leads the service. He utters a sentence, and the long lines of turbaned men below us rise and fall like clockwork in their devotions. During our stay in Constantinople, we visit the seraglio, in which is the old treasury of the Sultan, and later we drive out past the palace of Yildiz, where His Majesty lives. His grounds contain many acres of forests and gardens, in which are ravines, lakes, and babbling brooks, for he has a large income, although his people are so poor. He has altogether over 30 palaces and keeps thousands of servants. There are 100 porters, for instance, and it takes hundreds of cooks to prepare the food for the palace. In the Sultan's stables there are 2,000 horses, and the finest of all the Arabian horses are sent to him. He has many slave girls as wives, according to law, and formerly the most beautiful women that could be found in Georgia and other parts of the Caucasus Mountains region, where the women are noted for their beauty, were bought and brought here to be members of his immediate family. According to the Mohammedan law, every true believer has the right to 4 wives, although most Mohammedans, for several reasons, have only one. One reason is that the better class women do but little work, and only a rich man can support several wives. Another reason, so the Turks tell us, is that with one wife a man may have peace in his family, but that more than one often bring trouble and discord. When we visit the Mohammedans in their homes, only the girls of our party are permitted to go into the women's apartments. It is not polite for a man to ask after the wives and daughters of his friends. The sexes are kept apart, and a young man seldom sees his betrothed until the wedding. The marriage is all arranged by the parents, and the young people are supposed to take without question whomsoever their fathers and mothers select. In many Mohammedan families the men and women do not eat together, nor do they associate with one another at parties, and, as we have seen, whenever a woman goes about on the street, she keeps her face well covered. The Turks are very polite. They are continually making elaborately courteous remarks to one another. When we meet them they accost us by saying in Turkish, "May thy day be happy," and if we would be as polite as they are, we must reply, "May thy day be happy and blessed." They are very hospitable, and we are frequently asked out to dinner. They usually eat but 2 meals a day, one at 10 o'clock in the morning and the other at sunset, although they may take a cup of coffee on rising. They do not use tables, but have their meals served on trays, some of which are as large around as a washtub. In the center of each tray is a mat, on which the hot dishes are put with the salt, pepper, pickles, and other such things about them, new trays being brought in with the different courses. At a real Turkish meal, in the interior, every person has his own spoon, and helps himself to the soup in his turn. Meat and other viands are often brought on cut in small pieces, and are eaten with the fingers. The people are very dainty in using their fingers, touching the food only with the thumb and 2 first fingers, or dipping it out with a piece of bread doubled up and held in the hand. One Turk, being asked if he did not think our way was more cleanly, he said, "Everyone knows whether he has washed his fingers, but you can never tell who washes the knives and forks." We find the food very good. One of the most common dishes is pilaf, made of rice and chopped meat stewed together. This is served at almost every dinner, and when well cooked is delicious. We enjoy the Turkish fig paste and the nougat, or candy of nuts and sugar, and also the rose jam, which the servant brings in with a glass of water and a spoon. We eat the jam in the approved Turkish fashion, taking first a spoonful of jam and then a swallow of water, which dissolves the jam and leaves a taste of perfume in the mouth. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 39. In Modern Greece. How would you like to make a trip into fairyland? There is a little country not far from Constantinople, from which have come some of the strangest stories ever told. There are stories of huge giants who breathed forth fire and flame, who were conquered by Hercules, stories of Pegasus, a horse which had wings so that it flew through the air, carrying its master over mountains and seas, stories of Io, a beautiful maiden who was turned into a snow-white cow through the jealousy of the goddess Juno, and stories of the soldiers of Ulysses, who among their other experiences were changed into swine by the wicked witch Circe. There are stories of gods and goddesses, of sweet singing sirens, of horrible harpies who were half bird and half woman, of centaurs who were half horse and half man. So many strange stories, in fact, that I must not stop even to mention them all. You may read of them, perhaps in the poems of Homer, who lived there several thousand years ago, or in the Tanglewood Tales and Wonder Book of our own Nathaniel Hawthorne, who has retold these old stories in a beautiful way. This wonderful land is Greece. It is a little country consisting of some mountainous islands and the mountainous peninsula which extends from the foot of the Balkan Peninsula between the Aegean and Ionian seas. Greece is only about as big as our state of West Virginia, and it is so wild and rugged that most of the land cannot be cultivated, but it has nevertheless been one of the most important countries of the world. It was the birthplace of our civilization. When the rest of Europe was inhabited by savages and wild animals, Greece had cities and towns and cultivated farms. It had many little republics, each with its own government and its own laws. The Greeks were then noted for their strength and beauty, and they often held public games where the men and boys from everywhere came to try who was the strongest and most skillful. They were artistic, and they built some of the grandest temples and carved some of the most beautiful statues the world has ever known. They were learned. They had famous orators, poets, and scholars, and their language was so beautiful and their methods of thinking so clear that the literature of ancient Greece has always been a source of inspiration to scholars everywhere. It is still studied in the colleges all over the world. The ancient Greeks became a great commercial nation. The country has many excellent harbors, so that its people naturally have always taken to the sea. Their huge boats, propelled by triple banks of oars, went to all parts of the Mediterranean Sea, exchanging the choicest products of Greece for those of other lands. They became so rich after a time that other nations made war upon them. They resisted the attacks of the Persians, but were conquered later by the Romans, who readily assimilated Greek culture and refinement, and in time carried the Greek civilization with them along the Rhine, and to all parts of southern Europe. Hundreds of years later this same civilization, developed and modified somewhat by the different peoples that transmitted it, came with our forefathers to North America, so that the little country of Greece was really the originator of much of our own manners and customs and thought. All this, however, came from the ancient Greeks, who lived long before Christ was born. Since that time the country has been conquered again and again, and its people have been so oppressed and ill-treated by their savage victors that it has at times become almost barbarous. The Goths overran it during the Middle Ages, and when the Turks captured Constantinople, they took possession of it, and ruled it in their miserable way until shortly after the beginning of the last century, when the Greeks rebelled, and through the assistance of some of the great nations of Europe, became an independent people. They have now their own parliament, elected by themselves, and a king who is a descendant of the royal family of Denmark, and they are rapidly improving in civilization and wealth, as we shall observe during our travels among them. We have left Constantinople by steamer, and have come to Athens, the capital of Greece. What a beautiful city it is, and how modern! It has many magnificent buildings of the purest white marble, and thousands of 2-, 3-, and 4-story homes of brick covered with stucco. The walls of the houses are either white or of the most delicate pinks, blues, and yellows, so that we seem to be in a city of many colored marbles, roofed with red tiles. The streets are paved with cobbles, and the sidewalks with flagstones. There are palaces with gardens about them, and parks filled with trees and beautiful flowers. The business sections look like those of an American town, and the stores have plate glass windows displaying all sorts of beautiful goods. Do you hear that locomotive? That shrill whistle announces the arrival of the steam cars from the Piraeus, the seaport of Athens, which is over the plain about 5 miles away, and that bell that you hear is rung by the conductor on that streetcar over there, by which we can ride to any part of the city. We thought we were coming to one of the oldest places of the world, but we seem to be in one of the newest, until we take a stroll outside the town, through the ruins which are lying about on every side. We realize still more that we are on the site of old Athens when we climb the Acropolis. This is a gigantic block or hill of rose-colored stone, which rises almost straight up above Athens on the edge of the city. Upon its top there is a plateau of about 10 acres, covered with broken columns, marble statues, and the remains of the most wonderful buildings of ancient Greece. Here are the ruins of the Parthenon. The great columns which once upheld the roof of that beautiful temple still rest on their pedestals. Here was the statue of Athena, the goddess of war, which was 38 feet high and made of ivory and gold. Near the Parthenon are the ruins of another temple, with a portico upheld by tall Grecian maidens in marble. And there are so many other wonderful ruins to be seen outside Athens and in other parts of Greece that it would take many months to explore them. We are more interested in the Greeks of today. Notice, for instance, that man driving some goats, who is now coming toward us. He is dressed in short skirts and tight trousers, with an embroidered jacket which comes to his waist. He has red shoes with black tassels as big as a chestnut burr on the toes, and a red nightcap on his head. He is one of the milkmen of Athens, and lives in the country near by. See, he has stopped at that house over there, and is kneeling beside one of his goats. He is milking it for the servant girl who stands by his side and looks on. The most of the Athenians drink goat's milk, and to be sure they get it fresh and unwatered, they insist that the goats be driven from house to house and milked at their doors. Do you want a ripe orange, or some figs fresh from the trees? If so, you can buy them cheap of that Greek boy coming down the street. He is driving 2 little donkeys loaded with baskets of fruit. Greece has many fine fruits. It has the most delicious of oranges, and they are so cheap that we can buy all we can eat for a very few cents. But perhaps you desire something sweeter. Well, in that case, we shall call over that old woman who is walking along on the opposite sidewalk behind the fruit peddler. She has a thick comb of honey fastened to a branch in her hand. It is the honey of Hymettus, and it was gathered by the bees from the yellow flowers which grow on the mount of that name. It has a delicious flavor. The honey of Hymettus has been noted for ages. Greece is a land of sweet-smelling, honey-filled flowers, and the bees work as hard here as anywhere else in the world. But look at that boy who is coming out of the street at the left. He is carrying a big dish of smoking roast meat. Behind him comes a girl with a plate of baked fish sprinkled with onions, and farther back are several children carrying loaves of hot bread and other things fresh from the fire. Where can they be going? They must be on their way to supply some great public dinner. No, each child is carrying only the food for its own family. The dishes were dressed at home and taken to the baker to be cooked in his oven at so much a dish. The Greeks have small kitchens, and their ordinary cooking stove is not fitted for roasting and baking. It is a brick or stone ledge built about 3 feet high against the wall, with several small holes in the top. Each hole has a grating and an opening below it in the side, which furnishes the draught. Upon the grating a little charcoal is put, and the fire is made hotter by fanning. Only boiling and stewing can easily be done on such stoves, so when a family has a large roast, it sends it out to the baker. If we follow those boys and enter their houses, we shall discover that the poorer Greeks live very simply. Many families have but 2 rooms, one often serving as dining room, bedroom, and kitchen. Some of the houses are built around courts, without yards or gardens. The better classes have homes much like those we saw in Berlin, Vienna, and Paris. They live in apartments or flats, a number of families in the same house, only the rich having separate houses. We see all sorts of peddlers as we go on with our walk. There are men with lemonade and candies, and men peddling onions and garlic, which they have woven together in ropes and sell at so much a string. There are men driving turkeys along from house to house, so that the customers may pick out the turkeys they want from the flock. There are men in skirts and red caps riding on horses and donkeys, and men, women, and children dressed as we are, in carriages driven by coachmen in skirts and red caps. There are private soldiers wearing the jackets and petticoats, which form a part of the national uniform, and smart-looking officers in suits of white linen. There are many priests dressed in black gowns and high caps, which remind us of the churches of Russia, for the Greeks and the Russians have much the same faith, and nearly all here belong to the Greek Orthodox Church. There is a great deal of business done on the streets. We see women wearing the long, loose gowns of the country, knitting outside their houses, and shoemakers pegging away on the steps. There are cafes everywhere with tables outside them, surrounded by men who are playing dominoes while they chat and drink coffee. The coffee is black and costs 2 or 3 cents a cup. Some of the men are very excited. They are talking politics, for these people are great politicians, and even the waiters at the hotels and the drivers on the streetcars think they know just how the governments of the whole world really should be run. The Greeks have their own political parties and elect the parliament which makes all their laws. They are patriotic and very proud of their progress since they became free of the Turks. They had built hundreds of miles of railroads. They now have public schools all over Greece, which all children are required to attend. The Greeks are fast becoming well educated. The boys and girls are anxious to learn, and we shall meet few who cannot read and write. The school books are in the same characters that the ancient Greeks used, and it is not uncommon to hear a boy recite the tales of Homer in the original, or repeat the orations of Demosthenes, a famous Greek orator who lived over 22 centuries ago. Athens has again become a seat of learning. It has a university with thousands of students, a girls' college, which is one of the largest and best of the Far East, and many scientific institutions. 50 different newspapers and periodicals are published, most of them in the Greek text. Many of the people speak several languages, and we frequently meet girls and boys of 8 and 10 years who address us in English. We learn that scholars come here from all parts of the world to study the ruins of old Greece and the wonderful collections in the museums, and we spend some time at the American College, where students from our own country come to study Greek literature and art. We are surprised at the wealth of Athens and at the extent of Grecian commerce and trade. The ports are crowded with shipping. The country has several hundred merchant steamers and more than 3,000 sailing vessels in addition to numerous coasters. Owing to the excellent harbors and the nearness of all parts of the country to the coast, many of the Greeks become sailors, and Greek ships now do a large part of the business of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The Greeks almost monopolize the trade of this part of the world. They have established Greek banking houses and stores at all ports of Asia Minor and Egypt, and at the chief cities along the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. There are many more Greeks living outside Greece than at home. There are about 8 millions of them in the world, and only a little more than 2 millions live in Greece, the others having gone abroad as sailors or to engage in commerce. They are so successful as traders that it is a common saying in the countries about the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea that 1 Greek is equal to 2 Jews at a bargain, and everyone knows that the Jews are shrewd traders. But suppose we leave Athens and take a trip across the peninsula to Corinth, where we can get a vessel which will land us in Italy. We go by rail, stopping now and then at a station for a drive off into the country. How beautiful everything looks! The sky is bright blue, there is a silvery tinge to the mountains, and the shadows of the fleecy clouds make patches of dark blue velvet on the silver gray hills. We pass through fields of wheat, barley, and rye, in which great blood-red poppies are growing. We go by orange groves, where the yellow balls peep at us out of the green foliage, and see thousands of gnarly olive trees with the plum-like fruit ripening upon them. There are fine-looking men and women at work in the fields gathering the crops. They are cutting the grain with sickles and scythes, and tying it into sheaves with their hands. Nearly all the farming is of the rudest description. The fields are hoed or spaded instead of being plowed, and all the seeds are sown by hand. There are many small farms, and the farmer in most cases owns the land that he tills. As we near Corinth, we enter a region of vineyards, and should we go on south across the Corinth peninsula, we should see hill after hill covered with vines. It is these vineyards that yield the Zante currants, the seedless grapes or raisins which are shipped to all parts of the world. They form the chief export of Greece and bring in many millions of dollars a year. Shiploads of them go to the United States, and I doubt not every one of us has eaten them again and again in puddings and cakes. They are not much bigger than peas, but they have such a delicious flavor that there are no other grapes equal to them, and they grow best right here near Corinth. It is from Corinth that their name, currant, comes, and our currants, although they are a different fruit, were probably named after the Zante currant on account of the similarity in size and appearance. We see the people picking the grapes. Hundreds of men, women, and children are gathering them and laying them out on trays to dry in the sun. After drying, they are packed up in boxes and crates and then sent to Patras and other ports. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 40, Venice. We take ship at Corinth and steam out through the Gulf of Patras into the Mediterranean Sea. The sky is bright, the water is a deep blue, and in the bright sunlight the mountains seem to be dusted with silver. We sail in and out among the Ionian Islands, and then turn to the north, and are soon going through the Strait of Otranto into the Adriatic. We sail up this long, narrow sea for 2 days, coasting by Albania and the independent little country of Montenegro, and on the third morning find ourselves at anchor in front of a great city which seems to rise up out of the waves. There are thousands of buildings apparently resting in water, which flows through the streets and washes the walls of the houses. There is water to the right and water to the left, between the city and the shore, and by climbing up the mast of our steamer we can look over and see water behind the city. And still the shore is everywhere but a few miles away. It is low and marshy on the water's edge, but farther back the land rises, and away off in the distance is a wall of high mountains, their peaks covered with snow. Those mountains are the Italian Alps, the other side of which we explored while in Switzerland, and the country off which we are lying, extending hundreds of miles to the westward and southward, is the great kingdom of Italy, which we are now to explore. The city in front of us is Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, a mighty port which has grown up on about 100 little islands away out here in the sea. The islands have bridges connecting them. They are covered with houses, and are so cut up by canals that the water itself seems to form the foundations of the city. The canals are the streets. Our steamer sails up into one of the wildest of these water highways. It is the Grand Canal, an avenue of water wider than one of the boulevards of Paris, filled with barges, launches, and all sorts of queer little boats moving to and fro. In Venice, almost all the traffic is carried on by boats. There is not a dray, a cart, nor a carriage in the whole city. There is not a cow nor horse. There are not even the little donkeys of which we saw so many in Greece. The hucksters and vegetable peddlers go about in boats from door to door, stopping under the kitchen windows to cry out their wares. The cargo from the steamers is taken in barges to the factories and warehouses. People go calling in boats, and many of the children use boats in going to and from school. The houses rise abruptly from the canals, and you can step from your house right into your boat. There are no front yards, back yards, or side yards, and a Venetian boy never swings on his father's front gate. The streets are usually back of the houses. They are narrow stone pavements bordering the canals, and are for foot passengers only. They wind in and out, crossing the canals by bridges so arched that boats can pass under them, and in our walks we shall be always going up and down hill. But see those odd-looking boats coming out to the steamer. They are long and narrow and turned up at the ends, with a little cabin in the center. They are painted black, and the only sign of color about them is in the bright cushions which can be seen through the cabin windows. Those are gondolas, the water cabs of Venice, in which we shall make our trips through the city. At the stern of each boat stands the gondolier, who is sculling it along with an oar which he twists from side to side, swaying to and fro as he does so. We motion to one of them to come to the ship and give us a ride through the city. The gondolier moves his boat to the gangway, he helps us aboard, and we step inside the cabin. He then takes his place at the stern, and we soon hear the splash, splash, splash of his oar as he sculls us on through one street after another. We move up the Grand Canal among craft large and small, past palaces which have been turned into hotels and warehouses, by great factories with humming machinery, and on by the homes of the people, where families are sitting out on their balconies, chatting and enjoying the air. Now we are floating under the parlor windows of a magnificent house, and the music of a piano comes down to us. We hear the soft strumming of a guitar in the hands of one of a pleasure party rowing toward us, while the cries of hucksters peddling vegetables, fish, and fruits from other boats sound loudly over the water. We tell the gondolier to turn into the smaller canals, and are soon floating through alleys so narrow that we can touch the stone walls on either side. The high houses shut out the sun, and the water seems black in the shadows, while our walled road is roofed with a strip of blue sky. What a lot of strange things are going on in the canal! We see men and boys in swimming suits diving down into the water and floating about. Here are the playgrounds of the children. Every boy in Venice must learn to swim, and the little ones take to the water like ducks. There is a boy now diving out of the side window of his house, and there is another crawling up out of the water to the front door. There are women washing clothes on the steps of their houses and drying them on the roofs or on ropes stretched from one house to another across the canals. Farther on are some children in boats, and beyond them are passenger boats going from one part of the city to another. Leaving the smaller canals, we come again into the Grand Canal, our gondola rocking up and down in the waves of the larger boats passing near it. We stop for a moment to look at a great marble bridge which crosses the canal from one island to another. This bridge is the Rialto, one of the most famous bridges of the world. It is more than 300 years old and was formerly noted as one of the business centers of Venice. It swarms with foot passengers from daylight to dark. It is so wide that shops have been built upon it, and passing over it is like going through the aisle of a department store where men, women, and children are shopping. We buy some oranges of the fruit peddlers at the end of the bridge, and then step down into our gondola and glide onward past some of the finest buildings of the city to the hotel. Our hotel is in one of the old palaces. We walk up marble steps and go into wide halls floored with mosaic. Our bedroom is enormous. It has a stone floor, and its walls and ceiling are covered with paintings, so that angels and cupids are looking down upon us from above as we awake in the morning. Almost all the houses of Venice are built of stone brought in ships from the mainland. In many instances, cedar piles were driven down into the sand to make the foundations, as in Amsterdam and St. Petersburg, and upon them these great stone structures were built. On account of the dampness, stone and cement are still used for the floors, layer after layer being put on until a thick floor is formed. The last layer is composed of fine bits of colored stone, carefully fitted together, and so rubbed down that it forms a mosaic as smooth as polished marble or glass. Venice is celebrated for this sort of stonework. The Venetians make not only floors and walls of mosaic, but also the most beautiful jewelry and pictures, one picture often containing thousands of bits of colored stone and glass so fitted together that you cannot see the joints and might suppose that the colors were put on with a brush. We spend several days in studying the industries of Venice. We visit the glass works, the mosaic works, and the factories where they are weaving beautiful silks and cloths of all kinds. We frequently go to the square of St. Mark's to look at the famous cathedral, and the 4 bronze horses which stand high up on its front, and also the famous bronze lion on a tall column nearby. When I said there were no horses in Venice, I meant only flesh and blood horses. The horses of St. Mark's are of metal and hence do not count. Yet they have, probably, traveled more than any live horses you know. They are supposed to have once adorned one of the triumphal arches of Nero, the Emperor of Rome. The Romans considered them so beautiful that they took them to Constantinople when that city became the capital of the Roman Empire. Later, Venice conquered Constantinople and brought the horses back here. When Napoleon overran Italy, he carried them to Paris. There they remained until he lost his empire when they were brought back to Venice. The square of St. Mark's is the largest square in the city, and about the only place where there is much room for strolling about. It is walled on 3 sides by buildings which seem one vast marble palace, blackened by age and the weather, with this square in the center. On the other side of the square is St. Mark's Cathedral. The lower stories of some of the buildings are occupied by shops and cafes, which open out upon arcades, where in the evening thousands of men, women, and children walk to and fro. There are tables and chairs in the square, and people sitting at them eating ice cream and drinking coffee, chocolate, or wine, while they listen to the music of the military bands which play there 4 nights a week. More interesting than this is an event which occurs every afternoon at just 2 o'clock, when grain is scattered over the stones and the pigeons come by the thousands from all parts of the city to eat it. We are late in arriving and find the square filled with these beautiful birds. We buy a little bag of corn from an old woman peddler and throw out several handfuls, stooping down as we do so. The pigeons swarm over us. They light upon our heads, shoulders, and backs, and even eat from our hands. We must be careful how we treat them, for if we should kill one we might have to go to jail for 6 months. This feeding the pigeons is one of the old customs of Venice. The people love them, for it is said that once, when the city was in danger, it was saved by a letter brought by a carrier pigeon. At another time, we are told, Venice gained a great victory over its enemies by information obtained in a similar way. We spend some time in wandering about St. Mark's Cathedral, which is one of the finest of Europe, and then go through the palace of the Doge, in which the Venetian council sat centuries ago, when the city was a republic. From the second story of the palace, we cross the canal to the prison nearby upon the Bridge of Sighs. It is a covered stone passageway through which the criminals came to be tried and punished. We stop here a moment while our guide reads the verses from Byron's poem which refer to the city. I stood in Venice on the Bridge of Sighs, a palace and a prison on each hand. I saw from out the waves her structures rise, as from the stroke of some enchanter's wand. 1,000 years their cloudy wings expand around me, and a dying glory smiles. O'er the far times when many a subject land looked to the winged islands' marble piles, where Venice sat in state, throned on her 100 isles. Even the foundation of Venice is interesting. It was started by the Veneti, who lived near the coast on the mainland when the barbarians under Attila came over the Alps into Italy and took Rome. The Veneti fled for refuge to these sandy islands, and here built their little homes. At first they caught fish and sold them. They evaporated the salt from the water, and after a time built up a great business in fish and salt, which were then in even greater demand than at present. As they grew richer, they began to trade in other things. They sent out merchant vessels, and soon became the chief commercial people of the Mediterranean. Their islands were situated at the head of the Adriatic Sea. Hither goods could be most easily brought by water to be sent across the low passes of the Alps. This gave the Venetians a great trade with northern Europe. Their ships soon went to all parts of the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea, and in time out through the Strait of Gibraltar to England, France, Holland, and Belgium. In the Middle Ages, the fine goods from Asia were brought overland to the Mediterranean ports, and thence shipped to Venice. From here they were carried across the Alps to the Rhine, and from there to all parts of northern Europe. Other goods were sent back in exchange, and Venice increased in wealth. Factories of various kinds were established, and as the Venetians were skillful, their city soon became a noted manufacturing center. It grew more and more powerful, and in the 14th century it was an independent republic. It had its own army and navy, and made war on other cities and took some of them. Its merchants were among the richest of that time, and they owned 3,000 trading vessels, which carried their goods to all parts of the known world. This was at the time of the Crusades, when all Europe was excited because Jerusalem and the tomb of our Savior were in the hands of the Mohammedans, and armies of soldiers were formed to go to the Holy Land to redeem the city. One of the best ways thither was by way of Venice, so that for many years a stream of soldiers poured through the city, adding thereby to its wealth. It continued to grow until the route to India around the Cape of Good Hope was discovered. After that it was found that goods could be brought more cheaply from Asia by sea, and the trade of Venice began to decline. The discovery of the New World by Columbus was another blow to the prosperity of the city, for this brought the Atlantic ports into prominence, and now there are several ports on the Mediterranean which have more commerce than Venice, and scores of cities in the world which are richer and more powerful. Venice has now less than 200,000 people, although it has grown through the opening of the Suez Canal, by which it has regained some of its Asiatic trade. A railroad has been built which connects it with the mainland, and goods from Asia now come by way of the canal to Venice, and are sent on through the tunnels in the Alps to Central and Northern Europe. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 41, Northern Italy. We have left Venice and are riding on the railroad through the rich plains of Lombardy. On the north we can see the mighty snow-capped wall of the Alps, which shuts Italy off from the other countries of Europe, and not far to the southward is the long range of the Apennines, which extends down through the peninsula clear to its foot. We are traveling over some of the richest soil of all Europe, so rich that it produces 2 crops of grain every year, and in the irrigated portions as much as 10 crops of grass. The plain of Lombardy is the basin of several large rivers, such as the Po and the Adige. It is twice as large as Massachusetts, and about half of it is composed of irrigated lands. We ride for hours through rice fields, through grain fields and plantations of cotton, passing many orchards and vineyards. There at the right of the track they are cutting the grass. The men are mowing it down with scythes, and women and boys are turning it over with long poles, while others are raking the dry hay together. There are no mowing machines. Many of the fields are spaded and hoed, and the plowing is done with old-fashioned wooden plows tipped with iron. The chief business of Italy is farming. The country has a great deal of excellent land. There are rich valleys on both sides of the Apennines, and many plains upon which millions of cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys are pastured. There are vineyards which produce grapes so abundantly that Italy ranks next to France as the chief wine-producing country of the world, and there are orchards of olives, oranges, and lemons in almost all parts of the peninsula. Much of the land is owned in large tracts and let on shares. In some districts the people who live in the mountains come down in families and bands to work in the harvest fields. Each band has its own leader, who makes all the arrangements as to wages, and who tells the men, women, and children just what they shall do. The wages are very low, good-sized boys and girls getting but a few cents a day. But suppose we leave our train at the station and visit one of the villages to find out how the farmers live. The houses are of rough stone and mortar, and in some cases covered with stucco. The smaller houses have but 2 rooms, a kitchen on the ground floor and a bedroom above. The floor is of brick, stone, or earth, and everything is of the rudest description. The window panes are of paper, and the furniture of many a house consists of a bench, 2 or 3 chairs, and a table. We look about in vain for beds. The children sleep on the floor of the kitchen, and the grown people on great sacks of straw laid on the plank floor of the room above. That brick ledge at the side of the room is the cook stove. Those little basin-like holes in the top are for charcoal, and the draught comes up through the holes in the side. They are much like the stoves of the Greeks. The baking is usually done in an oven outside the house, and such families as do not have ovens take their bread to the public bakeries, as we saw them doing in Greece. The Italian peasants live plainly. Their food is chiefly bread and a cornmeal mush called polenta, with now and then a bit of meat or some coarse macaroni. The farmer often goes out to work after eating only a piece of dry bread. At 8 o'clock he stops for another meal of dry bread, and at 11 comes home for his breakfast of cornmeal mush and perhaps some vegetable soup. At night he has a dinner of cornmeal soup or bean soup with some rice or macaroni. As a rule he has meat only on feast days, but he eats plenty of onions, garlic, and lettuce with olive oil as a dressing. In some parts of Italy the people eat a great quantity of chestnuts, roasting them or grinding them to a meal and mixing them with flour for their bread. The nuts are not so sweet as our chestnuts, but they are 3 times as large. Many are bigger than horse chestnuts. The houses we have described are among the poorest of Italy, but there are thousands like them. There are also thousands of country houses much better, where each family has several rooms, and there are houses still larger owned by well-to-do peasants. There are castles and palaces belonging to the nobility, and large tenement houses in the cities, where many families are crowded together, each having but 1 or 2 rooms. The most of the peasants are poor, and their homes are little better than hovels. As we travel from one part of Italy to another, we discover that the peasants dress differently in the different sections. In Lombardy they wear cotton clothing while at work in the fields. Many go barefooted, and some wear wooden shoes, not unlike those we saw in Holland and Belgium. On Sundays and feast days the young men wear clothing of wool mixed with silk. Many of them have jackets and knee breeches of cotton velvet, hats of soft felt, and thick leather shoes. At such times the women wear dresses of wool, or in some rare cases silk. An Italian woman's greatest ambition is to own a silk gown. In many places the women wear square pieces of embroidered muslin on their heads instead of bonnets or hats, and some have bead necklaces of gold, silver, or gilt. The Italian peasants are very good-looking, the most of them having dark hair and eyes and dark rosy faces. Many of the poorer Italians carry on some kind of work in their homes. The people are very artistic, and the men do beautiful carving and painting. They also manufacture all sorts of small articles. The women knit, spin, and weave, and even the little children do their share of such work. How would you like to raise silkworms? There are more than 500,000 people engaged in this business in Italy, and of these many thousands are little boys and girls. Italy produces more than 150 million pounds of silk cocoons every year, and it has a large industry in silk weaving and reeling. We pass by groves of mulberry trees as we go on with our journey. It is upon the leaves of these trees that the silkworms feed, and the soil of northern Italy is just right for growing them. We see little children of 6 and 8 years gathering the leaves and spreading them upon the trays where the worms are. The worms bite off bits of the leaves and eat them. In some places thousands of worms are feeding, and as we stand and look on, we can hear the chopping of their jaws as they cut up the green leaves. After feeding in this way for a time, the worms are ready to spin their cocoons. They draw the silk out of their bodies and wrap it around and around themselves in an egg-shaped cocoon, each making a little house for itself, where it hopes to lie until it comes out a butterfly. After the cocoons are made, the people boil them to kill the worms inside, and then unwind the silk, and by doubling it again and again and twisting it together, they make the thicker thread from which silk cloth is woven. Italy, as we know, has long been noted for its silks, for you may remember we have already heard how the silk weavers of Italy went to Lyons, France, during the Middle Ages to make silk. At the present time the best silks of Europe are made in France and Germany, and millions of pounds of Italian cocoons are shipped there every year to be turned into silks. We see more people reeling silk as we go on toward the slopes of the Alps and to the beautiful Italian lakes, and we find great quantities of beautiful silk goods in the stores of Milan and Genoa. We are delighted with Milan, for it has such a business air about it that it reminds us of our American cities. It is situated in the heart of the rich plain of Lombardy, where it can easily be reached from northern Europe by the railroad tunnels through the Alps, so that it has become a great commercial center. It now contains more than 500,000 people, and is one of the best business cities of Europe. It has fine buildings of marble, as well as big stores, broad streets, and beautiful parks. Its people are good-looking, and are noted for their wealth and fine dressing. The Milanese are very proud of their city, and especially of their cathedral, which is one of the most beautiful in the whole world. The Milan Cathedral is a great Gothic structure made of the purest white marble beautifully carved. There are marble statues on every part of it, so many indeed that we can count several thousands and then leave off in despair. We climb up the 494 steps of the tower for the magnificent view which we there get of the city, the Alps, and the plain of Lombardy, and then take train for Genoa, the birthplace of Columbus. We see the monument of Columbus as we leave the railroad station. It is a white marble statue standing near an anchor, with a marble figure kneeling before it, and other figures representing America, geography, religion, strength, and wisdom sitting about. Columbus was born in Genoa in 1436. He was the son of a wool comber, but his father gave him a good education, and he began life as a sailor. He had already made a number of voyages when he applied to Genoa for money that he might attempt to discover a new route to India by sailing to the westward, but he was refused. He then laid his plans before the courts of Spain, Portugal, and England, and finally persuaded King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain to give him the 3 small ships with which he found the New World. Genoa, in the time of Columbus, was a very great city. It was a rival of Venice, and its people owned numerous islands in the Mediterranean. They had their factories and business houses in Constantinople, Asia Minor, and along the Black Sea, and their ships went to all parts of the known world. Genoa has an excellent harbor, and it is today an important port and a great manufacturing center. It is so beautiful that its people call it La Superba, or the superb city. The land about the harbor rises in hills which are backed by the Apennines. The houses cover the hills, and in our walks about through the streets we seem to be always climbing up or going down. The most of the buildings are large. Many of them were erected as palaces by the rich nobles and merchants of ancient Genoa, and many are now divided up into apartments so that a score of families may live in one old palace. In most of the buildings, the first and second floors are given up to offices and stores, while the floors higher up are the dwellings. Some of the streets are very narrow, winding about between walls 100 feet high, with breaks at the cross streets. The people who live in such streets have no gardens, and they stretch wires or ropes from building to building, and from window to window, to dry their washing upon them, so that at times we have to walk carefully to avoid the dripping water. We drive out to the Acqua Sola, the great park of Genoa, and afterward to the Campo Santo, its strange cemetery, where many of the monuments are statues representing the dead as they looked while alive. We spend some time in the shops, admiring the fine silks and velvets and the silver and gold filigree work for which the city is noted, and then take a train for Rome, stopping at Pisa, Leghorn, and Florence on the way. At Pisa we see the wonderful Leaning Tower, and at Leghorn watch the making of hats and straw braid. At Florence we visit the great cathedral, the bell tower of Giotto, and the celebrated picture galleries, which are among the finest of the world. We stroll along the river Arno, which flows through the town, and make excursions into the fertile plains of Tuscany, driving through vast vineyards and groves of olives and oranges. The scenery is very beautiful, and we regret we cannot spend months exploring the country. We make an excursion, however, to the tiny republic of San Marino, situated on a rocky hill in the Apennines, about a half-mile from the sea. This republic is, perhaps, the smallest of the world. It is only 24 miles square, and it has a population of only about 8,000, but its inhabitants have governed themselves for hundreds of years, while the other countries of Europe have been governed by kings. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 42. Rome, the capital of Italy. Italy is shaped like a great boot, about half as wide as from New York to Washington, and about as long as from New York to Toledo. The top of the boot extends out in a wide flap up the foothills of the Alps, and the toe looks just as though it were about to kick the island of Sicily. Not far from the center of the front of the boot, just where the middle of the shin would be if it were a human leg, a little river flows out of the Apennine Mountains down to the Mediterranean. It passes over a wide plain called the Campagna, and as it nears the sea it flows by 7 little hills which, for more than 2,000 years, have formed the site of one of the greatest cities of the world. This river is the Tiber, and the city is Rome, the capital of Italy. When Rome was first settled, the Tiber was deeper than it now is, and seagoing vessels came right up to the hills. The town, being on the hills, could be easily defended, and the rich country about it was well fitted for pasture and farming. There were easy ways over the mountains to other parts of Italy, and ships could be sent out to all the lands of the Mediterranean. So you see the situation of Rome helped to make it a great city and the capital of Italy. The race which founded it was brave and warlike, and it soon conquered the whole Italian peninsula, and made war upon nation after nation outside, until in time it formed the great Roman Empire, and became master of almost all the known world. At that time the chief civilized nations lived about the Mediterranean Sea. Italy has the most central position of all countries on this sea. It has excellent harbors and one of the best situations for commerce and trade. The Romans cultivated their territory largely by means of the slaves that they took in war, and as time went on they grew richer and richer. Their city became not only the capital of the world, but also the center of all that was inspiring in art and learning. The Romans had magnificent palaces and great public works. Their scholars wrote books, which are even now studied in our colleges, and their language, laws, and customs form a part of our civilization. In time, the Roman Empire was broken to pieces, but we shall find remainders of it in the ruins which are scattered everywhere throughout the city. Centuries later, Rome came under the control of the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church. This church was the chief one of Europe for hundreds of years, and it was the founder of another phase of civilization. Under it, great cathedrals were built, colleges were established, and some of the finest of the paintings of the world were made. We shall see evidences of all this in old Rome. We shall, at the same time, see the Rome of today, the capital of modern Italy and the home of the king and his parliament. We leave our hotel and drive to the top of the Pincian Hill for a bird's-eye view of the city, winding our way up over roads shaded with cypress trees and lined with gardens and beautiful flowers. At the end of our drive we find ourselves on a terrace high above Rome, north of the city, which covers the hills of the southward and fills the valley of the Tiber, winding along not far below us. That mass of huge buildings, with the high dome above them, on the opposite side of the river is St. Peter's Cathedral, and the palace of the Vatican, where the Pope lives. The square at our feet, with the obelisk in it, is the Piazza del Popolo, and that long, straight street, which cuts its way through the city, dividing it almost in half, is the Corso, one of the chief business streets of the Rome of today. Turning to the right, we see a great wall winding its irregular way about the town, enclosing many ruins, some rising out of gardens and vineyards. That is the wall of Old Rome, which was 14 miles in circumference, but which encloses only a part of modern Rome. The ruins are of wonderful interest. We can see some of them from the Pincian Hill. Their vast amphitheater beyond the buildings in front of us, with its walls half in ruins, is all that is left of the Colosseum, the greatest showground of all times. There lions and tigers and wild beasts once fought together. There half-naked men tried to kill one another with swords and spears. And there men, women, and children were thrown to wild beasts because they were Christians, to give the heathen Romans a holiday show. A little to the left of the Colosseum is the Forum, where the Romans held their meetings when the city was a republic, and where the greatest of the Roman orations were uttered. It now looks more like an excavation for a building than anything else. The Rome of olden times was many feet below the Rome of today. But the Forum has been dug out, and it now forms a great pit, filled with broken columns and blocks of marble, in the heart of the city. Notice the great building above the Forum? That is the Capitol, on the site of the citadel of old Rome. It is there that the Italian Senate meets, and there also is a museum in which are some of the finest statues which have come down from old Rome. Everywhere we turn, there are so many wonderful buildings and ruins that it will be impossible for us to visit them all. The city has scores of museums. It has many picture galleries. It has priceless collections of ancient manuscripts and is celebrated for its paintings, sculpture, and architecture, as well as for its business and social advantages. We engage carriages at the Pincian Hill and drive about through the streets. There are many old palaces, with modern buildings among them. There are fine stores with plate glass windows. There are streetcars, telegraph wires, and all the appointments of our most modern cities. We can hardly realize we are in a town 2,000 years old. We stop in the People's Square and take a drink from the fountain, where the water spurts forth from the mouths of the lions. We pause a moment before the great obelisk from Egypt, and then drive on through the Corso, passing magnificent turnouts filled with richly dressed ladies and gentlemen. The Corso is crowded. The better classes are dressed as we are, and the people upon the streets look not unlike those of Paris and London. Now and then we see a peasant in a cap and short jacket, his trousers held up by a sash about the waist, and now a rosy-cheeked maiden in short skirts with a bright handkerchief tied round her head. There are peddlers going about with their wares on their heads, and hucksters driving donkeys and mules. There are priests everywhere, walking along singly and in pairs, or in processions from one part of the town to another. They wear long gowns, some white, some black, and some brown, and many have high hats and cowls. There are processions of nuns and sisters of charity, for Rome is still the chief city of the Catholic Church, and as such it is a holy place to Catholics all the world over. We visit the Church of St. Peter. It is by far the largest church in the world, and we feel lost within it. We next wander about outside the Vatican, where the Pope lives. He has a magnificent palace with 4,000 rooms, and a library of 100,000 volumes, including some of the most valuable manuscripts ever written. Some of our mornings are spent in driving about outside Rome, in the Campagna, where one day our guide takes us down under the earth into the catacombs, which are vast caves and tunnels cut out of the soft volcanic rock. There are miles of these tunnels, some lined with cells and shelves which contain human bones. They are not far from the city, and were probably first dug as the burial places of the Romans. Later on, when the Christians were persecuted, they fled to them for refuge, and lived here for years, away down out of the light of the sun, having their food brought in at night. Our guide goes in front with a light, taking us through tunnel after tunnel, and winding his way this way and that. We follow him closely, and hold tightly to one another's hands, trembling at the thought of being lost away down here under the ground, and of trying in vain to find our way out. We visit the palaces of the king, and spend some time in Parliament, watching the Italians make laws for themselves. We go to the government buildings, where we discover that Italy still holds an important place among the countries of Europe. We learn that it has a great army and navy, and that its inhabitants are fast growing in intelligence, although the education of the common people is still far below that of the French, Germans, or English. The law requires that all children be sent to school, but it is not always enforced, and many of the men and women cannot read nor write. We ask as to Italy's trade, and are informed that it is rapidly growing, and that the people are among our good customers. They are importing a great deal of grain, cotton, and other things from America, and sending back fruits and olive oil, as well as silk and wool and other goods in exchange. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 43. Naples and Mount Vesuvius. The Italians have a saying, "See Naples and die," for they say you will then have seen the most beautiful city of the world. And indeed it is beautiful. The sky is almost always bright, and it is nowhere brighter than at Naples. The Mediterranean is almost always blue, and at the Bay of Naples its color is glorious. The city, as it rises about the bay, tier above tier, seems a city of palaces. There are hazy blue mountains behind it, and south of it is the great brown volcano of Vesuvius, with its steaming cone standing out against the blue sky. But let us see how it looks in the city itself. We leave our hotel and climb up through the streets. Many of them are steep, and we are always going up or downhill. The high buildings are close to the sidewalks, and the streets are so narrow that in places the walls shut out the sun. They are not over clean, and in some streets the smells are offensive. The people live in flats or apartments, and in the poorer quarters of the city whole families dwell in one room. What curious things the people do on the streets! We see men and women sitting down on the pavements making their toilets. There is a woman combing her hair, and here is one washing her baby. There is a cobbler at his bench soling a pair of old shoes, and beside him a tailor is working away. What a lot of children there are everywhere! There are two babies sprawling on the edge of the gutter. Here comes a boy of 8 driving a donkey, and there is another with a can in his hand pulling along 2 milk goats from door to door. He is one of the little milkmen of the city, and is probably helping his father, whom we see with those goats farther on. There are donkeys carrying all sorts of things. Here comes one loaded with fruit, and behind are 2 others ridden by boys. The donkeys are not bigger than Newfoundland dogs, and their ears are almost as long as their legs. Many of the Neapolitan boys have their own donkeys, as our boys sometimes have ponies. Do you like roasted chestnuts? There are men selling them here on almost every block. They have little furnaces and basins of charcoal on which they roast chestnuts out in the streets. We pass fruit stands every now and then, and buy delicious pears for 10 cents a dozen, and oranges 2 for a cent. See the crowd of men and women about that cook stand? They are buying roast sausages and stewed macaroni. Italy is famous for its macaroni, and quantities of it are exported to our country every year. See, there is a man eating some now. He twists his fork around and around in the dish and takes a great mass of it in at one gulp. He does not cut it, but sucks in the long strings until the whole has gone down his throat. Suppose we visit one of the factories and learn how macaroni is made. Such factories are to be seen in all parts of Italy, for macaroni forms a large part of the food of the people. It is made in different sizes and shapes, sometimes in long strings, sometimes in pipes as big around as your finger, and sometimes in sticks about as thick as a knitting needle. The finer kinds are called vermicelli and spaghetti. We see the tubes of white dough drying on the racks in front of the factory, and when we go in find a score of men and boys hard at work. Each boy is so covered with flour that his dark rosy face looks almost ghastly in contrast with his sparkling black eyes. He is in his bare feet, and his sleeves are rolled up to his shoulders. The men are mixing the flour into dough and kneading it with great bars so fastened to hinges that they can press the dough down on the table. After it is thoroughly kneaded, they carry it to a cylinder in which there are many small holes, so arranged that it can be pressed through them. It comes out in long pipes or sticks, which the boys carry to the racks in the sun or to the hot drying rooms which some factories have for the purpose. Let us stroll on down to the bay. It is filled with shipping, for Naples is the chief port of the Italian peninsula, and its harbor is one of the finest of Europe. The city is as big as St. Louis, and has a vast trade with all parts of the Mediterranean, with northern Europe, and with North and South America. It also does a great business in fish and in coral and sponges. It has many fishing vessels, and its people go fishing, not only in the Mediterranean, but out to the Atlantic and elsewhere. But the most interesting thing about Naples is not in the city itself. It is the great volcano outside, only a short drive away. Vesuvius is the only active volcano on the continent of Europe, and it is one of the most interesting volcanoes of the whole world. It is early morning when we start out to explore it. The first part of our journey is in a carriage driven by a Neapolitan coachman who cracks his whip every minute and keeps his team on the gallop. We rattle out of the city over pavements of lava, now almost running over a baby, and now making the dogs howl as with drooping tails they leap out of our way. We go through small villages of lava-built houses, by vineyards and gardens walled with lava, and then up through foothills of volcanic sand, until we enter a region which is all bare, brown lava. There is lava everywhere, and in all sorts of shapes. We pass through seas and rivers of lava which once flowed like fire, but which now are cold and dead, and as we look up, see a column of steam hanging like a gigantic umbrella over a brown lava mountain, the volcano of Vesuvius. The mountain is perfectly bare. There is not a bit of grass to be seen anywhere. It is all lava, ashes, and volcanic sand. The road going up winds in and out until it at last becomes so steep that we must leave the carriages and mount donkeys. When about 2,000 feet above the sea, we reach the observatory, where instruments are kept to register the movements of the mighty volcano. How the earth rumbles! It was shaking as we rode up on our donkeys, and here by the instruments we can see just what motion is going on away down in the heart of the mountain. The director of the observatory informs us that Vesuvius is always more or less active, but that there is no present danger. He describes the first recorded eruption, telling us how a little more than 1,800 years ago the volcano was covered with farms, the slopes being cultivated almost to the top. Then there were vineyards all over the land where the lava and ashes now are, and hot springs on the edge of the mountains, where the rich Romans came for their health and for sport. There were beautiful towns on the plains nearby, and among others the two fashionable resorts of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Pompeii contained about 25,000 people. It was a rich residence city, and its inhabitants had beautiful homes, temples, and theaters. The rich were living in fine style, giving parties and dinners, and driving about in their chariots with gay, prancing horses. The poor were at work at their trades. The merchants were selling goods in the stores, the children were going to school, and all sorts of business were being carried on, when one day, without warning, the great mountain burst forth, sending vast volumes of steam, ashes, burning rocks, and mud high into the air. There were so many ashes that they darkened the sun and turned the day into night. Even at Rome, hundreds of miles to the northward, the sun was hidden. The people thought that the end of the world had come, and that an age when it would be always night had set in. At the same time it rained mud, and rivers of boiling hot mud flowed out of the crater down over the plain. The horses, sheep, and cattle which were pasturing there were drowned. The fields, the vineyards, and gardens were covered, and in the towns even the tallest buildings were soon buried. They all disappeared, and the region became a great plain of ashes and mud. As time went on, new towns grew up on the plains, and crops of all kinds were raised there. The buried cities were blotted out of the memory of man, as the volcano had blotted them from the face of the earth. So it remained until a little more than 150 years ago, when a peasant who was digging a well struck his spade against a statue. He dug it out, and soon it was found that there was a city down there, buried under the earth. The government of Italy took possession of the place, and for years it has had men at work unearthing the city. The scholars began to investigate the history of the region, and it was found that the site of the lost city of Pompeii had been discovered. The great eruption occurred in the latter part of the 1st century of our era, and for a long time thereafter the volcano lay quiet. During the 18th century there was another terrible eruption, and in 1822 the whole top of the mountain burst off and formed a great chasm, 3 miles in circumference and about half a mile deep. Since then other eruptions have caused streams of lava to flow out of the crater, until now Vesuvius seems to be only a vast mass of lava, rock, sand, and ashes. Leaving the observatory, we again mount our donkeys and make our way up the mountain. At last we reach the station from where we are to ride up to the crater by rail. The railroad is a little like the one up Pikes Peak, but more like one of our cable car lines. The track has three rails, one in the center which supports the weight of the car, and others at each side for the guiding wheels, which keep the car from jumping the track. The cable attached to the car runs around a wheel at the top of the mountain, and is moved by an engine at the station below. The sides of the car are open, and we get a magnificent view of the Mediterranean as we rise through the volcanic sand up the steep mountain. We go rapidly upward, and at last we stop near the crater, over 4,000 feet above the sea. Here we hire other guides and pick our way over the thin coating of lava to the mouth of the volcano. The air is hot and full of sulfur fumes. We cough and hold our handkerchiefs to our faces in a vain effort to keep out the fumes. The wind is blowing the steam away from the crater, and we walk carefully over the crust and look down into a vast pit walled with yellow sulfur, in the bottom of which a lake of fire is seething, sending up steam, ashes, brimstone, and rocks. Now it seems to be quiet, and now it bursts forth, throwing stones high up into the air. They fall back, and we can hear them splash away down there in the crater. But now the wind changes. It is rising into a gale, and the stones are falling almost at our feet. Our guides drag us back and hurry us away, for fear we may all be killed by the burning hot stones. This is only a gentle eruption. When the great outbursts occur, the noise is like that of a battle, and rocks weighing many tons are shot upwards for hundreds of feet. About 50 years ago, 20 sightseers were killed where we now stand by a sudden eruption of lava, pieces of rock being thrown a mile high. At such times the steam rises to a height of more than 2 miles, and the whole mountain is covered by an umbrella of ashes and vapor more than 5 miles in height. How warm the earth is! We dare not stand still. We seem to be walking upon a hot stove. We smell our shoes burning. We bend down and touch the lava with our fingers, but draw them away quickly, smarting with the heat. One of the guides asks us to look at the cracks in the earth, and we see golden streams of molten lava flowing through them under our feet. He thrusts an iron rod into one of the cracks and brings out a lump of the red-hot metal. He asks us for a penny, and he presses it into the mass with a stick. He then drops the lava off the rod into a bucket of water which a boy has brought up. The water hisses and steams, but the lava soon cools, and the guide takes it out. Our penny is now embedded in the lava like a raisin in a bun, and we take it home as a relic. But see, the boy is pulling some eggs out of his pocket. He points to the water and offers to cook them for us. He rests the bucket over a wide crack where the molten lava is not far from the surface. The intense heat soon boils the water, and the eggs are cooked hard. We carry them with us back down the mountain and eat them with our lunch at the railroad station below, priding ourselves that we are among the few Americans who have eaten eggs cooked on a volcano. We then ride back to the carriages and drive over the plain to the site of the once buried city of Pompeii. There is a great wall about it made of the ashes and stones which have been already dug out, and we find many boys and men digging and carrying the stuff out in baskets on their backs and their heads. A large part of Pompeii is already uncovered, and we walk through streets walled with the curious buildings which were blotted out by Vesuvius 1800 years ago. The earth and ashes have so preserved the buildings that they look today almost as they did at the time of the eruption. The roadways are paved with stone, and in some of them we can see the ruts made by the wheels of the chariots. We walk through the amphitheater where the people had their shows, and sit down on the marble seats of the bathhouses where the boys of Pompeii sat when they had finished their baths centuries ago. We wander about through the houses, peopling them with their old Roman owners. Many buildings are of brick and many of stone. They are nearly all of 1 or 2 stories, and some are very large. They had wooden roofs which were burned off by the ashes. Many of the houses have walls covered with paintings, and in some beautiful statues in bronze and marble were found. Some had fine paintings and all sorts of beautiful things in metals and carvings. The floors of many were formed of different colored stones, fitted together in mosaic pictures, and the Latin word salve, or welcome, was carved over their doors, while in one entrance floor there was a mosaic picture of a fierce dog gnashing his teeth, and tugging at a rope as though he wished to get at you, while at his feet were the words Cave Canem, or Beware of the Dog. We are interested in the business parts of Pompeii, where there are streets of shops with marble counters, where the merchants were selling their goods when the mighty volcanic flood came. We peep into a public bake oven, in which black loaves of burnt bread were found when the mud and ashes were first dug away. We see casts of men, women, and children, and even of dogs, made by pouring plaster of Paris into the holes which their bodies formed in the ashes. And when we again visit the Museum of Naples, we are shown cooking utensils, toilet articles, rings, earrings, and bracelets, fish hooks and knives, and thousands of other articles of every description, all in common use among these people, when without warning they were destroyed by the ashes and boiling mud of the terrible mountain. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 44, Rural Spain. We have crossed the Mediterranean Sea from Naples to Barcelona, and are now traveling over the highlands of Spain. The country is different from any we have yet visited. The sun is wonderfully bright, there are few clouds, the air is dry, and the weather is hot. We are now on the great peninsula which forms the end of southwestern Europe, comprising the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal. It begins at the Pyrenees and extends so close to Africa that we could go from Gibraltar to that continent in a small boat in a very few hours. The Spanish peninsula is twice as large as Great Britain, and larger than either Germany or France. It is a high plateau, crossed by many ranges of snow-clad mountains, with rich valleys and dreary plains lying among them. It has but few navigable rivers, and although it is washed on almost all sides by the sea, its coasts are so steep that it has very few harbors. On the plateau the winters are cold, and the summers exceedingly hot, and in the far south it is so warm that bananas, dates, and other tropical fruits can be grown. We reach the hills soon after leaving Barcelona, and ride for miles in the mountains, now passing through forests, and now crawling along above magnificent valleys with their many-colored crops spread out like a vast quilt below us. Now our train flies by orange groves, and now through a country where for miles there are olive groves. We enter dense woods of chestnuts and oaks, and spend days upon high plains where vast flocks of sheep are grazing, watched by queerly dressed shepherds assisted by dogs. The sheep are the famous Spanish Merinos. This breed of sheep has been introduced into Australia, Argentina, and the other great sheep-raising parts of the world. There are many small towns with stone or brick buildings covered with stucco and roofed with red tiles. There are numerous villages in which the farmers live, going out to their work in the fields. Sometimes their farms are so far away that they use donkeys to ride back and forth. The roads are poor, and in the mountains everything is carried about on the backs of donkeys and mules. See that fat farmer riding up the road at the side of the track? He is as big as his donkey, and his long legs almost touch the ground as he urges the little beast onward. He wears a broad-brimmed, sharp-crowned hat and has a great cloak on his shoulders. Farther down the road is a donkey carrying two little boys, and still farther on a drove of donkeys loaded with grain, each having a bag on his back. They have neither bridles nor saddles, and are being driven by a rosy-cheeked, barefooted boy in the rear. Behind comes a boy with a cart load of grass. He is leading a little donkey which is drawing the cart. We see donkeys laden with fruit, and donkeys so covered with loads of hay that the hay seems to be walking off on four legs. There are also mules similarly loaded, and the whole of this part of Spain seems to be going muleback or donkeyback. Now we have left the mountains and are out on the plains. See the huge ox carts lumbering along the wide roads. Some of them are piled high with grain. The oxen are yoked to the tongue of the cart by a bar which rests on their necks and is fastened to their horns, so that they pull the loads along with their heads, and not with the shoulders as our oxen do. Notice the man plowing in that field over there? He is goading his oxen along with a stick with a sharp-pointed steel in the end. How simple the plow is! It is only a piece of rough wood tipped with iron, and it merely scratches the soil. That is a fair sample of the farm tools of the country. More than half of the Spaniards are farmers, but they farm very poorly. They raise quantities of wheat, barley, corn, and rye, but they do not get half so much out of the land as they might with better tools. A large part of Spain is so dry that little will grow upon it, but there are irrigated provinces which are exceedingly fertile and yield abundant crops. They produce the finest of olives and grapes, oranges and lemons, and all sorts of vegetables. Take, for instance, the lands near the Mediterranean Sea, about Malaga in southeastern Spain. In that region are grown the big green grapes sold in our stores. The soil of the vineyards is of a bright red color, and it is so rich that every bit of it is used. The vines are planted in terraces up the sides of the hills in regular rows, and only a few feet apart. They are carefully tended, and a little trench is dug about each vine to catch the water when it rains. The grapes are packed in cork dust and thus shipped to all parts of Europe and to the United States. Other varieties are made into raisins, and hundreds of thousands of pounds of large muscatel raisins are exported every year from Malaga Bay. In other provinces, wine is made in large quantities, and in some regions there are so many vineyards that we are reminded of our travels through the wine country of France, north of the Pyrenees. Another fruit of great value to Spain is the olive. There are olive orchards everywhere, and at one place we leave the train to visit a hacienda, where they are picking the fruit and turning it into the oil we use on our salads. The old Spaniard who owns the farm bids us welcome. As we walk along with him, he tells us that his house is at our disposition, and that his orchard is ours. The olive trees are much like plum trees, save that they are knotty and gnarly, and their leaves are a darker green. On some of them the fruit has a pale green color, like the olives sold in our grocery stores. Such fruit is not yet ripe, but it is pulled off at this stage and salted for eating. On other trees the olives are a dark glossy purple. They are ripe, and it is of them that they are making the oil. There are men shaking the trees and knocking the fruit off with clubs, and rosy-cheeked, barefooted, bareheaded children are gathering the olives from the ground and putting them into the bags and baskets, in which they are carried upon donkeys and mules to the mill. There is a man starting off for the mill. He has a half-dozen donkeys, each carrying a 2-bushel bag. The proprietor asks us to go with him, and we follow the donkeys to a rude building in which a mule is dragging one stone shaped like a wheel around through a circular trough or groove in the top of another stone which lies flat. This is the grinding machine. The olives are put into the trough in the flat stone, and the wheel crushes them to a pulp as it rolls over them. After being crushed, the olives are laid on straw mats, and these mats are placed one upon another in a press, where by means of a long, heavy beam in the top as a lever, the oil is squeezed out into a rude tank below. Water is mixed with the pulp in order to make the oil flow the more easily. The liquid that comes out is made up of water and oil, but the oil rises to the top and is skimmed off. The squeezed pulp is kept for fattening hogs, and the oil, having been cleared, is put into bottles for sale. Only the best of the oil is fit for the table, the poorer kinds being used for cooking. This olive plantation is not one of the finest, but it is a fair type of the plantations of Spain. There are many other estates where the olives are more carefully picked and handled. On such farms the fruit is pressed only lightly at first to get out the best oil. Afterwards it is ground up and mixed with boiling water and pressed again. Upon inquiring, we learn that olives grow in most parts of Spain, and that they are used everywhere by the people. About 1/30th of all the fertile land of the country is devoted to olive raising, and the orchards cover more than 2,000,000 acres. The trees are well tilled. They have their first fruit when 2 years old, and continue to bear for so long a time that the people have this saying: "If you would give a lasting fortune to your children's children, you have only to plant olive trees for them." The Spaniards use olive oil largely in cooking. We see the people eating it on bread and vegetables, and are told that it is cream and butter to many of the people, as well as their favorite dressing for salads. It takes the place of meat also, and many a Spaniard, when he takes a long journey, hangs a wicker basket of olives to his saddle horn and eats them as he rides. We are delighted with the country people of Spain. The men, women, and children are polite, and they wear such gay costumes that we have a new picture wherever we look. Many of the men wear blankets about their shoulders. They have broad-brimmed hats with sharp, conical tops, and short jackets and knee breeches, their legs below the knees being covered with stockings or wrapped around with rags. They wear sandals or queer-looking shoes. There are many beautiful women. Some of the peasant girls have caps with tassels so long that they hang down their shoulders. On Sunday they wear dresses of black velvet, over which they drape striped shawls of bright colors. Their skirts are short. Some have gaiters laced up to their knees, and others wear stockings bound with ribbons crossed over and over. In the fields we see barefooted women with handkerchiefs on their heads, and farther south are many dark-faced peasant men in turbans. Spain has a large variety of strange costumes, nearly every province having a dress of its own. In the larger cities the people look much as we do, save that the men often wear cloaks and the women have on mantillas, or veils, instead of bonnets. They usually wear black gowns when out on the street. The Spaniards are a fine-looking race, and their women are famous for their beauty. The most of them have dark, rosy faces, dark hair, and dark eyes, although now and then you meet a beautiful blonde. They age rapidly, however, the poor through hard work and the rich through idleness. The women of the upper classes take so little exercise that when middle-aged they become fat and dumpy. We are much annoyed by beggars as we travel through Spain, and we observe that there are many poor people. The peasants live simply. Their chief food is bread and olives, although they sometimes have eggs or pork or goat's meat. They are fond of salt fish and salt meat, and with their neighbors, the Portuguese, are the greatest codfish eaters of the whole world. The living at the hotels is fairly good, although the breakfasts are scanty. When we rise in the morning we have only a little cup of chocolate or coffee with bread and butter. This meal is called desayuno. About noon we have a breakfast of eggs, fish, and stew, and at the end of the day a very good dinner. One of the most common dishes is puchero, a vegetable soup cooked with boiled beef or fowl. The soup is served first, and then the meat and vegetables which were cooked in it are brought on. After this we have some kind of fried meat or croquettes, and then perhaps fish, and after the fish a dessert and fruit, ending our meal with cheese and black coffee. We are surprised to see the men everywhere smoking at their meals. They light their cigars and cigarettes even when the women are present, and we are horrified at times to see a woman take a cigarette and smoke with them. This is not common in public, although many of the Spanish women smoke in their homes. After dinner the people sit about the table and chat, and it is the same at the midday breakfast or luncheon. All business in Spain stops from noon until 2 o'clock, in order that the people may get their breakfast and have their siesta or their rest or sleep after it. This seems lazy to us, but in Spain the climate is so warm that it is not well for men to work in the middle of the day. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 45. In the Cities of Spain. Only a small proportion of the Spaniards live in large towns. The most of them are farmers and fruit growers whose homes are in villages scattered at wide distances apart over the country. The chief cities, with the exception of Madrid, which is in the middle of the plateau, a half-mile above the sea, are along the seacoast, or in the river valleys of the high plains, where the water can be used for irrigation. The cities of the northern provinces are somewhat like the other cities of Europe. Take, for instance, Barcelona, where we landed at the close of our voyage from Naples. It is as large as Baltimore and has fine stores, theaters, and many cafes. It is the chief business city of Spain, having an excellent harbor with a rich country behind it. Its chief street, the Ramble, running up from the wharves, is wide and lined with rows of trees furnishing magnificent shade. Barcelona has electric lights, street cars, and business buildings and houses which would do credit to any great city. Madrid, the Spanish capital, contains over 500,000 people. It is a great square town made up of immense square buildings, surrounded by a wall 12 miles in length. It is the highest of the European capitals, and is situated almost in the center of the plateau, with dreary plains reaching out for miles on every side. The climate is far from delightful. It is so bad that its citizens are said to live in an ice house for 3 months of the year, and in a furnace for the other 9 months. We spend a week in Madrid, and although it is summer, find it by no means uncomfortable. We follow the custom of the Spanish and take a siesta in the middle of the day, driving about during the mornings and evenings. We usually start out on our excursions from the Puerto del Sol. This is the chief public square of the city and one of the liveliest places in Europe. It is of the shape of a half moon, surrounded by high buildings with 10 wide avenues opening into it. From here, all the streetcars start, and here we can get cabs to take us to any part of the city. We enjoy the strange sights of the square. There are carriages of rich Spaniards coming in and going out of it in every direction. There are donkeys and mules loaded with all sorts of goods passing through, and now and then we see a regiment of soldiers moving across to the music of a band. The streets about the Puerto del Sol are usually crowded. There are many well-dressed men and many women in black gowns wearing black shawls over their heads. There are priests and monks in big hats and long gowns of various colors, some with cowls which hang far down their backs. There are sober-faced nuns and sisters of charity, and now and then a band of schoolboys walking along under the charge of a priest. The Spaniards are almost all Roman Catholics, and in many of the schools the priests are the teachers. Then there are newsboys shouting their papers, peddlers selling lottery tickets, milkmen, and men of all trades. In the evenings there are many people in cafes, reading, chatting, or playing dominoes, and scores of promenaders on the streets laughing and chatting with one another. Every Sunday afternoon during our stay in Madrid there is a bullfight in the great ring which the people have built for such shows. We are urged to attend, but we refuse. We do not approve of bullfighting, and we certainly would not go to a show on Sunday. Nevertheless, we cannot help learning a great deal about the sport, for at times our Spanish friends will talk of nothing but bulls and bullfighting. Attending such shows is the favorite amusement of the Spaniards, and a great bullfight here will attract more spectators than will gather to see a baseball match between champion teams in one of our cities. All the large towns of Spain have their bull rings, and hundreds of bulls are killed in them every year. Much of the fighting is upon horses, and as many as 5,000 horses have been gored to death in one season. At such fights the wildest and fiercest bulls that can be found are brought into the circus. This is a big ring with walls about it, above which are the seats for the people. In Madrid many thousands attend, and men, women, and children of all classes are among the spectators. We are told that even the women and girls clap their hands as they watch their favorite actors torturing the poor animals to death. The fighters are both on foot and on horseback. They are dressed in gay costumes, each having his hair done up in a knot at the back of the neck. The men on foot have red blankets, which they shake in front of the bull as soon as he enters the ring, to enrage him. As the animal darts for them, they jump to one side, and when he turns about, they again shake the red, the color which every bull hates, in his face. The men on horseback tease him with sharp lances, and as he grows angry, the men on foot throw sharp arrows decorated with bright colored ribbons into his shoulders or back. The arrows have sharp points barbed like a fish hook, so that they cannot come out, and the ribbons tied to their shafts wave gaily as the tormented bull runs around the ring. After a time, even the quietest animal can be made angry by such treatment. The beast soon becomes wild with rage. He darts after the men on horseback and tries to drive his horns into their steeds. Sometimes a horse is thrown to the ground and its rider gored to death. When the bull has reached this angry state, one of the men on foot tries to kill him by stabbing him with a sword. If he makes just the right stroke, he can drop him dead to the ground. But in many cases the poor beast is stabbed again and again. After the bull is killed, a team of horses is hitched to his horns, and the band plays while it is dragged out and another victim brought in. We spend some time visiting the great museums and art galleries for which Madrid is noted, and at the palace and in the government departments learn about the country. Spain is ruled by a king and a parliament, the lower house of which is elected by the people. The government of Spain has been bad in times past, and this is one reason why the Spaniards are poor. Both in city and country civilization is backward, and the common people are so ignorant that only 1 in every 4 can read and write. Spain has but few railroads, and although it has much good land and many rich mines of iron, copper, zinc, quicksilver, and lead, it is poor, and the government is greatly in debt. Its resources are little developed, and it is not increasing in population and wealth like many of the other parts of Europe. This is partly due to the character of the Spaniards, who were so enriched by the countries they obtained through the discoveries of Columbus and others that they became lazy, extravagant, and cruel, for people rarely make good use of wealth they have not earned. The Spaniards then secured fortunes without working for them and became the richest nation of Europe. Spain owned almost all South America with the exception of Brazil, and all Central America and Mexico, as well as the West Indies and the Philippine Islands. She enslaved the natives and brought gold and silver by the shipload home from those countries. She established colonies in them, but oppressed the people so that they rebelled and one by one broke away from her. And now Spain has no colonies of any importance. From Madrid we travel by rail, visiting the various provinces of the kingdom. We find that each state has the general Spanish characteristics, but that the people of the different sections each have ways and customs of their own. The Spaniards are made up of several race elements, owing to the fact that the country has been overrun again and again by other races. Spain was conquered by the Carthaginians, and afterwards was long held by the Romans. These in turn were overthrown by the Goths from the north. In the 8th century the Moors crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from Africa and drove out the Goths. The Spanish of today are the result of the intermingling of these different races. They resemble the Italians and French more closely than they do the Anglo-Saxons and Germans. The people are proud and patriotic and very hospitable in manner. If we admire anything in the hands of a Spaniard, he straightway offers it to us, knowing we shall refuse to accept it, and whenever we visit at any man's house, he tells us that the house is ours. We make one trip northward into the provinces where the Basques live, on the edge of the Pyrenees. These people are among the best of the Spaniards, being descended from the earliest inhabitants. The Basques are noted for their thrift. Their country is rich in minerals, especially in iron and coal, much of which is exported from the port of Bilbao, on the Bilbao River, not far from the Bilbao Bay. Another excursion is made to Valencia, the great silk and wine port of the Mediterranean, and afterward we go westward and visit Cordoba, Granada, and Seville. In this region the people are somewhat darker and we see many who remind us somewhat of the people of Turkey. The houses are different, and some of the cities are like parts of Constantinople. This region was long in the hands of the Moors, a race of warlike Mohammedans who crossed the narrow Strait of Gibraltar and conquered the country, pushing their rule so far north that for a time the French had the proverb, "Africa begins at the Pyrenees." The Moors held southern Spain for several centuries, and established their own civilization in it. They were among the ablest and most learned people of their time. They built great cities in Spain, and among them Cordoba, which at one time had almost 1,000,000 inhabitants. It had hundreds of public schools and a great university. It had 100 public baths and 100 mosques, the ruins of the greatest of which are still standing. We visit these ruins and stroll about through the forest of columns which upheld the great roof. We enter the Catholic cathedral, which has been built inside the mosque, and then stroll out into the narrow, dirty streets of the Cordoba of today. The great glory of the ancient Moorish city has long since passed away. Its population has dwindled to 50,000, and it now ranks with the smaller cities of Spain. Still, it has houses which make you think of its past. Many of them are of Moorish architecture, with lattice-work balconies, and with iron bars over the windows and doors. In Granada, not far away, we explore the ruins of the Alhambra, the huge red stone palace where the Moorish kings lived, and then go on to Seville. Here there is another great Moorish palace, the Alcazar, and also many beautiful Moorish houses, with walls painted in the brightest colors and windows heavily barred. Each is built about a court in which oranges grow and cool fountains play. There are date trees on the edge of the city, and in the country about groves of oranges and lemons and other tropical fruits. There are tobacco plantations, and we are shown a tobacco factory employing 5,000 women, which is said to be the largest in Europe. Seville is situated at the head of the navigation of the Guadalquivir River, and hence has a large trade. There are steamers loading oranges and lemons at the wharves, and we take passage on one of the orange steamers. We float down the Guadalquivir through a beautiful and almost tropical country, and at last come to Cadiz, the chief Spanish port on the Atlantic. Cadiz is situated on a beautiful bay and is surrounded by villages. It is one of the oldest settlements in Europe, having been a thriving port in the days of the Phoenicians, as well as in the times of the Greeks and the Romans. We find many ships in its harbor and take passage on one for Gibraltar, for we wish to see this great English fortress at the entrance to the Mediterranean before leaving Spain. The voyage is a short one, and we are soon landed at the foot of the enormous bare rock commanding the strait. We can see the forts before we come to it. 2,000 big cannon are looking at us out of its sides, and it fairly bristles with batteries and fortifications. This rock belongs to England, and although it is so small that you could walk around it in less than 2 hours, it is one of the most important forts of the world. It is the key to the Mediterranean Sea, and through it to the Suez Canal, and is of the greatest value in protecting the English ships which must go through on their way to and from Asia, Australia, and the Mediterranean ports. The English have also a naval station and a coaling port here. There is a good harbor at the foot of the rock, and upon it a town of about 30,000 people, including Spaniards, Greeks, Arabians, Italians, Africans, and English. We are met by English officers as we step from our steamer, and are delighted as we stroll about through the town to meet many people who can speak our own language. The English keep several thousand soldiers at Gibraltar all the year round, and the King of England appoints a governor who has charge of the colony and who is also commander-in-chief of the fort. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 46. The Kingdom of Portugal. How our hearts jump as we go to the shipping office near the wharves of Gibraltar and take passage for London. Our long tour is now about over, and we shall soon be crossing the Atlantic for dear old America. We have already traveled through every country in Europe except the little Kingdom of Portugal, and of this we shall see something while our steamer stops to take on cargo at Lisbon and Oporto on its way north. Portugal is like Spain in that it is generally mountainous, but it has also many rich plains. It is almost as large as Indiana, but it has far less arable land. It is noted for its fine fruit, its great vineyards, and forests of the oak whose bark furnishes the cork of commerce. It raises many cattle and sheep, and thousands of hogs are fed on the acorns which grow in the woods. Much wheat, corn, barley, and rye are raised in the valleys, although not enough to feed all the people. It is a land of flowers, and roses bloom all the year round. The breezes from the mountains and ocean make it cooler than Spain, so that in many parts of the country the climate is delightful. Portugal has several good harbors, and as most of its people live near the coast, they are a great seafaring nation. They early took to trading, and in the Middle Ages their ships sailed to Africa, to England, and to all parts of the Mediterranean. The Portuguese were the first to explore the west coast of Africa, and Bartholomew Diaz, a Portuguese sea captain, was the first white man to reach the Cape of Good Hope. This was 5 years before Columbus discovered America, and 10 years later Vasco da Gama, another Portuguese, made the first voyage around Africa to India. The most of the eastern coast of South America was discovered by Portuguese. It was a Portuguese explorer, Ferdinand Magellan, who in 1520 sailed up the Rio de la Plata, and then, after passing through the Strait of Magellan at the southern extremity of the continent, crossed the Pacific and discovered the Philippine Islands, where he was killed. Some of Magellan's ships sailed on around the Cape of Good Hope to Europe, and thus made the first voyage clear around the world. At that time the Portuguese went everywhere, and Portugal established colonies in South America, India, and other places, so that today there are more people who speak Portuguese outside Portugal than in that country itself. In South America, for example, Brazil, a state more than 80 times as large as Portugal, is inhabited by almost 3 times as many people. It is but a short voyage from Gibraltar to Lisbon, and we are soon steaming in through the mouth of the Tagus River and up to the city, which is 12 miles back from the coast. The river widens within a short distance from its mouth, and it is so broad and deep in front of the city that it forms one of the best harbors of Europe. It is visited by vessels from all parts of the world. We sail through shipping all the way up the river. The banks are high and steep, and upon them massive buildings painted in the brightest of colors show out through the trees. There are castles and churches on the tops of the hills, and beyond them are the ragged Sintra Mountains with their peaks in the sky. Lisbon and its suburbs border the Tagus for more than 9 miles, the buildings extending for 3 miles back from the river. The city has a population of about 400,000, and it looks quite imposing as we steam up to the wharves. Landing, we stroll about through the streets. Some of them are wider than the best avenues of our American cities. They are lined with trees and have excellent pavements. The buildings are large 2- and 3-story structures of gray stone, or of brick covered with stucco, and many of them are painted in the most delicate tints of red, blue, and yellow, so that the city looks fresh and gay. The people are as gay as their homes. They are well dressed and wear clothes of bright colors. Many of the men have suits of white linen with hats of white straw, and the women wear brighter colors than the women of Spain. The Portuguese are somewhat like the Spaniards, but not so tall or so heavily built. Their faces are darker, and we frequently meet one as dark as a mulatto. We now and then see a Negro among them, for the Portuguese were great slave traders in the past. They took cargoes of Negroes from Africa to Brazil, and some were brought here to Portugal. How many queer characters there are on the street! We meet peddlers going about with boxes and baskets on their heads, crying their wares. There are men upon horseback and ladies in carriages. There are scores of donkeys, some ridden by men, and others driven along loaded with bags, baskets, and even with stones. We see many priests and nuns, for the country is Catholic, and there are churches and monasteries in all of its towns. We pass fountains at every few steps. There are more than 30 in Lisbon, all fed by a great aqueduct which conducts water from the hills 8 miles away. Each fountain is surrounded by men, women, and children who are filling stone jars and casks and carrying them off on their heads to their homes. Many of the water carriers are Spaniards from the province of Galicia, who have hired themselves out as servants to the Portuguese. After our walk we visit the Library of Lisbon, which contains 300,000 volumes, and then spend some time in the government offices. We learn that Portugal has a king and a parliament, the lower house of which is elected by the people. We find that the country is backward in its adoption of modern improvements. It has but few railroads, and not more than 1/3 of the people can read and write. The chief business is farming, although in the north there are many cotton mills which make gay-colored calicoes for the African trade. Later, we leave Lisbon for a trip through the rich valley of the Tagus. This river rises in Spain, and after leaving the mountains, flows through plains of great fertility down to the sea, dividing Portugal into 2 almost equal parts. There are windmills on all sides of us as we ride up the valley. We pass bullock carts, dragging great loads over the highways, and donkeys and mules jogging along with brushwood, timber, and bags of grain on their backs. There are women and men at work in the fields. We stop to lunch in an orange grove, picking the ripe, juicy fruit from the trees, and as we near the mountains we pass by many large vineyards. We are especially interested in cork trees, from whose bark comes the stoppers used in bottles all over the world. There are thousands of acres of such trees in Portugal and Spain, some wild and some in cultivated groves. The cork tree is an evergreen oak, which when full grown is 40 or 50 feet high and sometimes as much as 5 feet in thickness. The corks are made from the bark, which is so soft that it can be easily cut into shape. The bark grows very slowly. A tree must be 15 years old before its bark becomes an inch or so thick and ready for cutting. After this, if the bark is properly taken off, the tree will grow a new coat every 8 or 10 years for more than a century. In taking the bark, 2 rings are cut around the tree, one just above the ground and one below the main branches. Between these, cuts are made lengthwise just deep enough not to injure the innermost bark, and the strips are pried off. After stripping, the bark is flattened out by heating it over a fire. It is scraped and cleaned and hardened by boiling or steaming, and then it is ready to be shipped to the markets. The bark is used for making bottle stoppers, cork legs, hat linings, the soles of shoes, life preservers, and many other things. The cork of Portugal is so valuable that it brings in more than $3 million a year, being next to wine the chief export of the country. We find men loading cork on our steamer when we get back to Lisbon, and as we sail out of the harbor towards the stormy Atlantic, we rejoice in the fact that we have so much cork on board that if our ship should be wrecked, we could not possibly sink. We stay only a short time in Oporto, the great wine city of Portugal, loading a cargo of sherry and port, and then steam on to London. Here we remain a few days to repack our baggage and complete our list of presents for our dear friends at home, and then, having finished our long tour of Europe, take a train for Liverpool, where one of the fastest of the great ocean greyhounds is waiting to carry us back to New York. End of chapter 46. Recording by BettyB. End of Geographic Reader, Europe by Frank G. Carpenter.